Meow. Do-do, meow. Meow. Do-do, meow. Meow. Do-do, bow. My bottom dollar. I'll tell you what, that pot, it's getting smaller. It's my bottom dollar.
Done enough to figure out that nobody can take this feeling. I'm looking out, it's clear now.
Something but it gave me meaning.
You had me burnt at the stake, but I'm
alive, I'm awake. Without you.
I took the fire to the food.
Part of me. Oh, you are the mercy. Shit my integrity again.
But I rose above the gravity, the sky, the earth, and all between. You flattened out my energy again.
Just getting some stuff ready. We only got 3 chapters left. They're long, but we got 3 chapters left. 53 pages left. Tear us into pieces. Alright, all the multi-streams are up, chats are working, everything's ready to go. After the song, we will begin. May the thunder gray will break every stone that you throw.
Never hear the end of me. I soaked you in the gasoline. I'll never need an enemy again, 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 again.
Two, one. My phone's charging, so I don't have my model up right now, but will. Give it charged at 31%, so it's going to be a minute. Uh-oh, uh-oh. Uh-oh, it's not picking it up. It ain't picking it up. All right, this should have done the trick. That hasn't happened in a while.
Aid light from small luminescent crystals mounted along the wall cast long, uneven shadows across the cramped cargo hold where Lizyra stood among rows of open crates. A slow yawn slipped from her as she shifted her weight against one of the containers, scanning its contents before marking something down on the wooden clipboard clasped between her gloved hands, its pages crowded with hastily written tallies and notes from the week's work. The hood of her cloak sagged low over her brow, muting her vision until the creak of the door behind her drew her attention. She reached up and pushed it back, turning just as Lumi stepped inside and moved down the narrow aisle between crates, a white paper box balanced carefully in her hands. "How's it looking?" Lumi asked as she approached, her voice light but edged with curiosity. Lizyra glanced down at her clipboard, then back into the crate before her as she exhaled through a tired breath. "Honestly, we've got so much more than we needed that I lost count somewhere around an extra 150, she said as she lowered the lid onto the crate and secured it in place. Her hands lingered there a moment before she looked up again, a faint crease of concern settling in her expression. "Do you think everyone's okay?" she asked. "It's not like them to go this long without checking in." Shifting the box slightly in her hands, Lumi came to a stop beside her, and said, "I'm sure they're fine." Though her voice carried confidence, a small touch of uncertainty lingered at the back of her mind. Everyone had different assignments this time, and Isaac's group couldn't even get into Gloomshade Temple until today, she added, tilting her head slightly as she considered it. "I wouldn't expect them back at Blue Wyvern until after the eclipse." The wooden crates were large and stacked high, blocking most the light as Lizyra moved down a row of them, sealing the remaining ones as she pondered a thought. "You know, we could just go back to Wormspire," she suggested, gesturing faintly toward the stacked crates as she spoke. "Drop all of this off and check if Morik or Torgan had heard anything." Large damaged segments of the road caused the wagon to jerk suddenly before settling back while Lumi shook her head, causing her long white bangs to shift across her cheeks. "If we were to do that, we wouldn't have time to make it back to Blue Wyvern for the next check-in," she replied, her tone steady as she glanced toward the door she had entered from. "We'd be late by at least 2 or 3 days trying to double back." A second yawn pulled at Lizyra as she finished fastening the last lid, her shoulders sagging slightly as the fatigue settled deeper into her bones. "It's not like anyone else has checked in yet anyway," she muttered, more to herself than anything. Her long elvish ears twitched as Lumi scratched the back of her head, taking a moment to think it through before saying, "There's always a chance we just missed them. If we were heading out while they were coming back, we could have gone through different town gates." After stretching her hands high above her head, Lizyra set the clipboard down on the nearest crate before looking back at Lumi. "How much longer until we get back to Blue Wyvern?" she asked. "I need to take a real bath," she added. "There's still frog slime in my hair and dirt under my nails, and if I have to dig up one more root or pick another mushroom, I swear I'm going to blow away in the next breeze." Lumi's ears twitched again as she winced. "Please don't," she said, setting the paper box beside the clipboard with a faint smile. She glanced toward a window at the far side of the room and added, "We should be there in 3 or 4 hours, maybe sooner. I think we're about to pass that graveyard from the other day." She flipped open the box as she spoke, revealing the last of the pastries inside before tilting it slightly toward Lizyra. "Do you want one?" she asked. "They're the last 2 from that shop we stopped at during our last check-in. I bought a whole box and despite how scrumptious they are, I can't finish them all." Lizyra instinctively wrapped her arms around her stomach, letting out a quiet, breathy laugh despite herself. "I think I've eaten enough of those in the past few days to put on 10 pounds, she said, shaking her head as the thought alone made her feel queasy. With a small shrug, Lumi closed the box again and lifted it back into her hands. "Guess I'll give them to Ragnar and Ragnus before they go stale," she said. "Call it a reward for sniffing out so many roots and horned Elden toads." Together they made their way out of the cargo hold, stepping into the narrow hallway leading to the junction that linked the wagon cars, the faint sound of trotting hooves and distant creaking wood surrounding them as they walked. At the end of the hall, Lizyra slowed near the bottom of the staircase ascending to the second story, glancing up its steps as she paused. I still need to check the barrels up top, she said lazily. No need, Lumi replied as she stepped up beside her, tucking her pastry box under one arm. Onyx already checked when he was fixing that clog in the water line. Everything's still pretty much full, except the wine. She huffed softly. Apparently that leak still isn't fixed. Lizyra pushed open the junction door and stepped through, the air shifting slightly cooler as they entered. That was actually pretty nice of him, she said over her shoulder. I'm pretty sure that was the last thing left to check, she added, glancing back toward the crates they'd left behind. Which means we're done with everything and with plenty to spare. As they moved through the next car and toward the stairs leading up to the deck, Lumi's gaze drifted over Lizyra more carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the details she'd overlooked before. Why are you still geared up? She asked, her tone shifting with mild curiosity. The day's already over yet you look as if you're ready for combat. Following her gaze down to the quiver resting against her hip, Lizyra ran her fingers along its edge as she walked. After what happened the other day, she said quietly, her voice tightening at the memory, when we stumbled into those cultists trying to summon that thing, she went on with a faint shake of her head, I'm not getting caught without my gear again. A small laugh escaped Lumi as she stepped ahead and pushed open the door to the deck, letting in the cool rush of outside air. That thing wasn't even what they were trying to summon, she said, glancing back over her shoulder with a half-smile. He told us himself that since we interrupted the ritual, he got dragged in instead of whomever they were trying to contact. Lizyra followed her out, stepping onto the deck as the open air brushed her face. Whatever he was, she muttered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders as her gaze dragged across the road ahead. He was creepy as hell, and I don't ever want to see him again, so hopefully he follows his own end of the pact. I'm not sure if it was actually part of the pact or not, Lumi said as she walked alongside Lizyra. But like he said, he doesn't want to see us ever again either. From the helm at the front of the deck, where the coach driver's throne overlooked the road ahead, Onyx shifted as he pulled his boots down from the dash plate and glanced back over his shoulder. His brow tightened as he said, You mean that fucking demon? In quiet protest, Lumi shook her head and replied, He said he wasn't a demon. Her tone was firm, though there was a hesitation behind it that suggested even she wasn't entirely convinced by the distinction. Onyx leaned back slightly in his seat, his grip resting loosely on the reins as the wagon creaked forward while he said, No, what he said sounded more like he was something far worse, and that mortals just slapped a name on his kind because we don't actually know what in the hells they really are. Lumi frowned as her ears dipped slightly then said, I don't think that's what he meant either, though the lack of certainty in her voice lingered in the air between them. A smirk tugged at the corner of Onyx's mouth as he tilted his head and suggested, Then why don't you blow that little horn he turned into and ask him yourself what he is? Lizyra's reaction was immediate, her voice rising as she stepped forward and planted her hands on her hips. No, she snapped, the word sharp with insistence. He said he didn't ever want to see us again, and we didn't even need to make a deal with him in the first place since we were trying to open the crypt doors wrong. Her frustration bled through as the memory clearly unsettled her, and she shook her head before adding, and for all we know, because he said he couldn't harm us after Lumi's pact, the first thing he'd probably do is fuck all the horses to death, eat the dragon rhino, and then wreck the caravan wagons. Dragging a hand down his face as the wagon wheels rattled beneath them, Onyx let out a breath through his nose before saying, I still can't believe you made a pact with some unknown thing that might actually be an evil demonic entity. Lumi lifted her chin slightly, meeting his concern with quiet resolve as she declared, As party leader, I did what I thought was necessary at the time to get us out of there. Behind his glasses, Onyx's eyes flicked toward the road before settling back on them. And now we've got a monster bound to a horn that could come out whenever it wants and kill all three of us, he added, his voice low. He doesn't live in the horn, Lumi said, shaking her head as she tried to clarify, I think it just calls him from wherever he actually is. Folding her arms across her chest, Lizyra said, Then we should bury the horn somewhere and forget it ever happened. I don't think Vincent or Isaac are going to be too thrilled when we tell them we made a deal with something like that, especially when we didn't even need to. Lumi's eyes widened as she stepped closer, her voice softening with compassion. No, what if he actually lives in it? Then we'd just be burying him alive, and I don't think you'd like that if it were you, she said, her conscience clearly pressing against the idea. I was planning on giving it to Adele so she could put it in one of her temporal storage dimensions. A dry humorless laugh escaped Onyx while he shook his head and said, "Great, so now whatever that thing is gets access to every ancient, dangerous, world-ending artifact we've collected over the years. That sounds like a fantastic idea." Pausing briefly, Asira's gaze drifted for a moment as she considered it more seriously, then said, "Actually, knowing Adele, she'd probably just turn it into one of her summons and force him into slavery." Knowing Adele, Onyx muttered as he adjusted his grip on the reins, "She'd probably turn it into a sex slave or end up teaming up with it instead, then come after us all." Lumi winced at that, glancing around instinctively as if the very air might be listening, and said, "Can you both not say things like that? What if he can hear you through the horn?" At that, Onyx reached down beside his seat and picked up his warhammer, its weight settling comfortably into his grip as he said, "If he can hear me, then he can come out and face us. I've dealt with worse than some whispering shadow hiding in a trinket," his confidence steady, though not entirely reassuring. Asira crouched down near Ragnar, her hand moving instinctively to scratch behind the wolf's ears as he stirred from his rest, while Ragnus remained curled beside him, and she said, "I don't know, Onyx. He said he was some kind of guardian of the eternal flames or something like that. That doesn't exactly sound like job a minor nuisance would be fated with," her voice lowering slightly as unease crept in. "There's no reason to fight him," Lumi insisted, her tone calming as she tried to bring the conversation back under control. "Right now, he's bound to me through the pact as a summon, and even if he did appear and we attacked him, he'd just return to Infernalis when he's defeated. Nothing would actually change, so if we just leave it alone, there's nothing to worry about." Onyx glanced back at her again, his eyes narrowing slightly as something else surfaced in his thoughts, and he said, "And what about what he said when he saw you transform? When he asked why you were walking among mortals, was he implying you're supposed to be in Infernalis?" Lumi's composure faltered at that, her face tightening as she snapped, "Please, Onyx, just drop it. I don't know what he meant, and I don't care. I'm where I belong." The words came too quickly, and her gaze drifted despite herself. "He said himself he hasn't dealt with mortals in centuries, so he probably mistook me for something else, or someone he thought I was." Her voice softened as she knelt and opened the pastry box. Carefully, she handed the last two pastries to Ragnar and Ragnus, watching as they stirred more fully now, their tails thumping lightly against the deck as they accepted the treat. Asira straightened slowly, her attention drifting forward as the road stretched out ahead of them beneath the sun's dimming light, and after a moment her eyes narrowed as she said, "Hey, there's someone up ahead," her tone shifting as alertness replaced the earlier conversation. Following her gaze, Onyx suggested, "We're coming up on that graveyard from the other day. Probably just the groundskeeper out tending the graves. We already cleared the overgrowth for him, so maybe we should stop and collect some form of payment for taking the time." Following her gaze, Asira straightened slowly, her attention drifting forward as the road stretched out ahead of them beneath the sun's dimming light, and after a moment her eyes narrowed as she said, "Hey, there's someone up ahead," her tone shifting as alertness replaced the earlier conversation. Following her gaze, Onyx suggested, "We're coming up on that cemetery from the other day. Following, Lizyra straightened slowly, her attention drifting forward as the road stretched out ahead of them beneath the sun's dimming light, and after a moment her eyes narrowed as she said, "Hey, there's someone up ahead." Following her gaze, Onyx suggested, "We're coming up on that cemetery from the other day. Probably just the groundskeeper out tending the graves. We already cleared the overgrowth for him, so maybe we should stop and collect some form of payment for taking the time." As the caravan drew alongside, the lone carriage pulled off to the side of the road. The creak of wood and the steady rhythm of hooves seemed to dull beneath a growing sense of wrongness, and all three of them looked down from the deck at the same time. What they saw stole the breath from the moment. A thick, dark pool of blood had gathered along the coachman's seat, its surface still wet as it dripped in slow, heavy strands down the side of the carriage, while both doors hung open on either side, swaying slightly as the wagon passed. Inside, the seats had been torn apart, their fabric shredded into jagged strips that clung to splintered wood like remnants of something that had tried and failed to escape. No bodies remained. No voices called out. Nothing stirred. Only the lone horse stood harnessed to the carriage, its sides heaving as it drew ragged breaths into the cooling air, its eyes wide and restless as it stared forward into the darkening road, as if whatever had done this might still be watching from somewhere just beyond sight. Lizyra said as she leaned over the guardrail, her eyes fixed on the abandoned wagon below. "Are we going to go see what's going on with that?" At the front of the caravan, Onyx shifted in his seat, glanced down toward the bloodied carriage and asked, "And who exactly are you planning to help, and what do you think you're going to do once you get there?" Focusing back on the road ahead of them, he added, "There's not a soul in sight besides the dim horse." Lumi's gaze lingered on the same sight a moment longer before asking, "What if they're actually in trouble? They could be injured somewhere out there in the woods or near the graveyard, maybe they got attacked and wandered off trying to escape," her voice carrying a reluctant concern as she looked between them. Without waiting for further debate, she snatched the reins from Onyx and brought the caravan to a gradual stop, the horses slowing under her command until the wagons settled into stillness along the side of the road. Once the wagons had fully stopped, she stated, "We're ahead of schedule, we overforaged, and we've got time to stop and help someone if they actually need it." Leaning forward in his seat, Onyx exhaled through his nose and said, "Please, this is exactly how roadside ambushes start. You walk right into it thinking you're helping someone, and the next thing you know you're 3 months pregnant with a goblin or kobold's crotch monster," he added, his voice edged with disdain, "especially since they don't even find their own females attractive." Ignoring him, Lumi stepped up onto the rail of the wagon, her cloak shifting around her as she balanced for only a moment before she floated down in a controlled descent, her boots brushing the dirt road with barely a sound. Lizyra followed a second later, less gracefully, dropping from the side of the wagon and catching herself in a crouch before rising with a crooked smile. From above, Onyx leaned over the edge of the guard railing and called out, "Have fun investigating your haunted roadside murder wagon, and let me know what you find when you come back," his tone dry as he remained where he was. Lizyra tilted her head back and looked up at him as she asked, "You're not coming?" Onyx answered while moving his eyes to the road ahead, "Someone's got to stay with the wagons, unless you'd like to explain to everyone later why everything we own is gone." Dusting off her cloak, Lumi began walking toward the abandoned carriage while saying, "Come on," her voice steadying as she pushed forward, "let's just see what happened." Together, Lumi and Lizyra approached the lone horse still harnessed to the wagon, its posture rigid and unnatural beneath the dimming light of the road. Lizyra reached out slowly and ran her hand along the horse's neck as she said, "Good horsey," her voice softening slightly before she added, "Now where did your master wander off to?" The horse did not react. It did not flinch. It didn't even blink. Its gaze remained locked forward down the road, fixed on nothing visible, its eyes dark, vibrating, and unreflective as if the light itself had stopped reaching them. Lizyra's hand hesitated on its neck as unease crept up her spine before finally saying, "Lumi, I think something's wrong with this horse. It hasn't even blinked once since we got here." Lumi's attention drifted away from the carriage and into the nearby tree line where the graveyard from their earlier passage sat partially obscured, and as she stared deeper between the trees, a faint unnatural glow flickered among the overgrowth. Unlike torchlight or lantern flame, the glow pulsed with a cold violet hue that seemed to bend the darkness around it rather than illuminate it. Pointing into the trees, Lumi said, there's a light over there. Lizyra followed her gesture, squinting into the brush before saying, or maybe Onyx was right and we should have just stayed on the wagon. Holding her gut, she waddled toward the tree line along the road, her unease creeping into her voice as she went on, maybe I'll just have a piss behind this tree, then we can head back to Blue Wyvern instead of getting involved in whatever this is. Frowning slightly as she stepped off the road, Lumi replied, stop panicking. The horse is probably just spooked or under some kind of spell or enchantment. Like the ones emitted by the wards Theo installed in all our wagons to keep the horses and Rhino from panicking when a fight breaks out. Without waiting for her own anxiety to consume her, Lumi pushed into the brush at the edge of the tree line, branches grabbing at her cloak as she followed the violet glow deeper into the overgrowth. Trailing Lumi with an arrow already set between her fingers and her hand ready to draw, they passed through the underbrush crossing the graveyard's broken edge. The trees opened into a clearing where gravestones stood scattered beneath tangled roots and thick vines, the entire site more overgrown than before, as if the earth itself had been reclaiming it faster than nature should allow. Lizyra stopped short and said, there's no way, her eyes scanning the area as she stepped forward cautiously, we cleared this entire place 2 or 3 days ago. It shouldn't look like this again already. Near one of the headstones sat a lantern with fractured glass panels, its frame barely intact as a violet flame flickered weakly inside it, struggling against a fuel source that didn't exist. Lumi approached it slowly and knelt beside it, inspecting the broken glass before looking into the reservoir and saying, that's strange, her voice lowering as she studied it more closely, there's no oil in here at all. No mana source or arcanix either. There shouldn't be any way for this to still be burning. A second lantern, further along the row of graves, drew Lizyra's attention as a faint green flame pulsed within it, its glow faint but steady in a way that felt wrong rather than magical. Lizyra moved toward it cautiously then hunched over it, observing the wick and reservoir as she said, this one's the same. It's completely empty too. From the other side of the clearing, Lumi said, I don't see anyone around here, and I'm not convinced this has anything to do with that wagon, her eyes still scanning the graves and shadows between them. Straightening slightly, Lizyra asked, should we take them with us? Lumi considered it for a moment before shaking her head and saying, no, leave them. They're not ours, and I don't want that Imperial patrol we passed earlier deciding we stole the graveyard's lanterns and coming after us for it. We'll search a little longer, and if we don't find anything, we'll report the wagon when we get back to Blue Wyvern. Lizyra exhaled slowly as she said, maybe Onyx was right. It's probably just the gravekeeper cleaning up whatever was left in the crypts the other day, her tone trying to settle itself as she turned back toward Lumi. But before she could take another step, the lantern behind her lifted from its headstone without warning, rising into the air as though something unseen had decided it no longer needed to obey gravity. Lizyra froze mid-step as the hairs along her neck lifted and her ears dipped instinctively toward her shoulders while her grip tightened around her bow. She turned slowly toward the floating lantern as she said, Lumi, are you seeing this? From deeper within the graveyard, Lumi answered without turning as she said, yes, I'm seeing the exact same thing over here, her voice tightening as her lantern began to behave the same way. Lizyra's breath caught as the green flame inside the lantern intensified, swelling in brightness before spilling upward beyond the wick as though it were escaping its containment rather than feeding it. The flame drifted free, hovering in the air for a brief moment before moving with deliberate motion toward something unseen beside the lantern. Only when the flame began to surge brightly did the shape begin to reveal itself, a shadow that had been waiting in stillness until light gave it form. As the green fire spread upward along its outline, a gaunt, drifting figure emerged from the darkness, its body only becoming visible where the flame clung to it, revealing a hovering specter that burned without consuming anything around it. Still clutching the now empty lantern in one hand, the shade drifted forward with a slow, haunting glide, its other arm already in motion as it brought an ethereal, translucent purple scythe down in a sweeping arc aimed cleanly for Lizyra's head. Dropping low as the blade carved through the air where her skull had been a second before, Lizyra scrambled backward through the wet grass and shouted, "Spooky specter," her voice cracking between panic and disbelief. The scythe's edge passed again, this time close enough to shear through the trailing ends of her vibrant green hair and the edge of her cloak, tearing the fabric as she rolled away and came up onto one knee with her bow already rising in her grip. Across the clearing, Lumi turned sharply at the sound of Lizyra's voice and saw it fully now, a ghastly, semi-translucent figure wreathed in green flame, its hollow shape flickering as though it existed only where the fire chose to reveal it. The shade let out a hollow, echoing laugh that seemed to scrape against the inside of the skull rather than carry through the air, and it pivoted midair as it swung its scythe horizontally again, forcing Lizyra to drop flat as the blade screamed just inches above her. Rolling onto her side, Lizyra sent an arrow in the same motion, her shot clean and fast, but the shaft passed straight through the creature's burning form without resistance and buried itself into the bark of a tree behind it. The shade's laughter deepened, amused, and entirely unbothered, as though the attack had never existed. "Lizyra! You're Arcanix!" Lumi called out as she stepped toward her. Lizyra's stomach dropped as realization hit, and she cursed under her breath while scrambling backward to her feet, fumbling with a pouch at her belt, her focus snapping to survival. Her fingers found a faintly glowing white Arcanix crystal inside, and she pulled it free before slotting it into her bow's grip with shaking hands, the mechanism clicking into place just as the shade drifted closer again. Drawing another arrow, she pulled the string taut, and its tip ignited with a steady, humming white light that vibrated faintly through the bow. She exhaled sharply and released. The arrow tore through the air in a streak of pale radiance, but just before it could strike, the shade vanished, its body collapsing inward as the green flame snapped back into the lantern in its grasp. The arrow tore through the air in a streak of pale radiance, but just before it could strike, the shade's body collapsed inward as the green flame snapped back into the lantern in its grasp.
Now, I have to paste it in on the other side. Just gotta give me a minute to find it. Oh, right here. 11 or 12. It's supposed to be 11 font size. What do you do? Oh, I should have asked that to Miss Shadow yesterday. I forgot. What font size does she use? Because I'm using 11, but I don't even know if that's like what people normally use. Sounds better. That sounds better.
The arrow tore through the air in a streak of pale radiance, but just before it could strike, the shade's body collapsed inward as the green flame snapped back into the lantern within its grasp. The arrow passed through the now empty space where it had been and struck nothing but air before finding its place against a nearby headstone, obliterating it to pieces within a spectacular. The arrow tore through the air in a streak of Passing through the now empty space where it had been, it struck nothing but air, finding its place against a nearby headstone, obliterating it to pieces within a spectacular white explosion. And, passing, the arrow tore through the air in a streak of pale radiance, but just before the arrow tore through the cemetery in a streak of pale radiance, but just before it could strike, the shade's body collapsed inward as the green flame snapped back into the lantern within its grasp. Passing through the now empty space where it had been, it struck nothing but air, finding its place against a nearby headstone and obliterating it to pieces within a spectacular white explosion.
Now that's what it's supposed to sound like. Give it a save. Give the paperback version a save. Because I have the ebook open in the paperback version. Oh, it's going to crash. Don't crash. Okay, there you go.
The arrow tore. She exhaled sharply and released. The arrow tore through the cemetery in a streak of pale radiance, but just before it could strike, the shade's body collapsed inward as the green flame snapped back into the lantern within its grasp. Passing through the now empty space where it had been, it struck nothing but air, finding its place against a nearby headstone and obliterating it to pieces within a spectacular white explosion. Explosion. Lizyra staggered to her right, already drawing another arrow as panic crept into her voice, and she said, what the fuck is this thing?" Behind her, Lumi uncorked a vial of silver, spinning on her. Behind her, what the fuck is this thing? Behind her, Lumi uncorked a vial of silver mithril nitrate with her teeth and poured the shimmering liquid along the edge of her short sword after pulling it free, the metal hissing faintly as it reacted. Spinning on her heel, she swung toward where the lantern had been, trying to strike before another shade could manifest, but her blade cut through empty space. The purple glowing lantern she had seen moments ago was gone. Her eyes darted across the graveyard as she searched for it, her breath tightening, and then she saw it further off between another row of graves. A second shade had begun to take form. This one burned with a deep violet flame, its body coalescing slowly around the light as it gripped its own empty lantern and dragged a matching scythe behind it, the blade whispering against nothing as it moved. Its laughter joined the first, overlapping in a discordant echo that twisted through the clearing as it angled itself toward Lizyra, who was now fending off both threats alone. Everything about it felt wrong. Its body was translucent, its flame visible yet intangible, but the lantern it carried remained solid and real, like an anchor tying it to this plane of existence. Lumi broke into a sprint toward Lizyra, her sword raised, but the moment she pushed forward, something unseen resisted her. She forced her legs harder, but instead of closing the distance, the ground seemed to betray her as she felt herself drifting backward, each step pulling her farther away despite the effort she put into moving forward. Her breath hitched as confusion overtook her, and she glanced down at her feet only for her vision to jerk upward instead, the canopy of trees filling her sight as though her senses had been twisted out of alignment. She tried to call out, to warn Lizyra, but when she opened her mouth, the sounds that came out were wrong, reversed, and broken, as if her voice were being forced backward through her own throat. What she tried to say, but the word collapsed into a warped echo. Panic surged as control slipped from her entirely. Her body jerked violently, no longer responding the way it should, and she toppled sideways onto the ground, her sword slipping from her grip as her limbs flailed against her will. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe, but even that felt unfamiliar, as though her body had forgotten the rhythm it had known all her life. Air caught in her throat, her lungs spasming as saliva flooded her mouth, and she gagged as foam gathered at her lips, her muscles convulsing in erratic.
Okay, so the AI just said the word wrong.
Spasming as saliva flooded her mouth, and she gagged as foam gathered at her lips, her muscles convulsing in erratic, disjointed motions. Across the clearing, Lizyra ducked beneath another sweeping strike from one shade while pivoting away from the second, barely managing to stay ahead of both as their scythes carved through the space around her. She couldn't even spare the time to draw another arrow as she shouted, "I could use a little help over here," her voice tight with strain. Lumi's vision blurred as she writhed on the ground, her body betraying her in every possible way as her limbs jerked and spasmed, her breathing uneven and broken while she fought against something she could not understand. Even thinking felt wrong, like trying to grasp something that slipped away the moment she reached for it. Lizyra risked a glance toward her and immediately felt her stomach twist as she saw Lumi convulsing on the ground, completely helpless. The realization hit hard. Whatever these things were, it wasn't just attacking the body. The two shades pressed in tighter, their laughter growing louder as their movements became more aggressive, their scythes cutting closer with each pass as Lizyra was forced further back. For a fleeting moment, she considered retreating into the trees where their reach might be limited, but the thought vanished the instant the green-flamed shade flickered. And in that same instant, a blur of fur and muscle burst through its form. Ragnar came tearing through the specter's body with a snarl, unaffected by the ghostly flame as the creature vanished on contact, and he clamped his jaws around the lantern in midair. Shaking his head violently, he whipped it side to side with brutal force before hurling it into a nearby tree. The lantern shattered on
Right, fixed it up, and we moving on.
side before, shaking his head violently, he whipped it side to side before hurling it into a nearby tree. The lantern shattered on impact, glass and metal bursting apart as it struck the trunk, and the green flame sputtered out. Shaking his head violently, he whipped it side to side before hurling it into a nearby tree. The lantern shattered on impact as it struck the trunk, and the green flame sputtered out instantly as the fragments scattered across the ground. Its laughter cut off abruptly as it ceased to exist. Turning slightly, the purple shade's flame flickered in agitation.
Don't like that next line. Now we're going to spend like 3 hours pondering how to fix it or deleting it. So we're going to take this sentence and make this one before it incredibly longer, but correct. Alright, let's see how this sounds.
The lantern shattered on impact as it struck the trunk, the green flame sputtering out instantly as the fragments scattered across the ground, cutting off its laughter abruptly as it ceased to exist. The lantern shattered on impact as it struck the trunk, the green flame sputtering out instantly as the fragments scattered across the ground, cutting off the specter's laughter abruptly as it ceased to exist. The lantern shattered on impact as it struck the trunk, the green flame sputtering out instantly as the fragments scattered across the ground, abruptly cutting off the specter's laughter as it ceased to exist.
Alright,
turning slightly, the purple shade's flame...
Shut up! Okay, there we go. That's the one. I hope. Is anyone there and that sounds like shit? Please let me know. I mean, it all sounds like shit, but more shit than usual. More shit than usual. Turn that to 11.5.
Shaking his head violently, he whipped it side to side before hurling it into a nearby tree. The lantern shattered on impact as it struck the trunk, the green flame sputtering out instantly as the fragments scattered across the ground, abruptly cutting off the specter's laughter as it ceased to exist.
Alright, I don't know why you stopped.
Exist. Turning slightly, the purple shade's flame flickered in agitation as it watched its counterpart disappear, its hollow laugh warping into something more frantic, almost fearful. While its attention shifted, Lizyra drew and released in one fluid motion, the Arcanix-enhanced arrow streaking forward with a bright, piercing glow as it punched straight through the lantern in the shade's grasp. Shattering instantly within an exploding white light, the lantern collapsed into fragments as the purple flame flared violently before imploding inward. Letting out one final, distorted burst of laughter as its form unraveled, the shade dissolved into a plume of violet smoke that dissipated into the night air, leaving nothing behind but the broken remnants of the lantern scattered among the graves. Lumi shot upright from her back with a ragged gasp that tore through her chest, her lungs burning as she coughed and wheezed, dragging air into herself like she had nearly forgotten how. "What in the hells was that?" she said between strained breaths, her voice shaking as she clutched at her throat. Lizyra nudged through the scattered shards of a broken lantern with the toe of her boot, her eyes scanning the pieces as if they might spring back to life. "I don't know," she said, her tone tight with lingering adrenaline, "but if Ragnar hadn't shown up when he did, I think you'd be a goner." Ragnar stood over Lumi, whining low in his throat as he licked at her face, his tail flicking with restless concern. Lumi let out a weak breath of a laugh as she reached up and ruffled the fur behind his ears. "You're such a good boy, Ragnar," she said while pushing herself onto unsteady feet. Rubbing at her throat as the soreness lingered deep in her chest, Lumi glanced back toward the graves before turning away from them. "We should get back to the caravan," she said, her voice steadier now but still edged with unease. They pushed their way through the brush as Ragnar padded close behind them, his tail swaying as he kept pace. As Lizyra vaulted over a fallen log, landing lightly on the other side, she shook her head and let out a breath. "That was by far the weirdest encounter I've ever had," she said while brushing dirt from her sleeve. "I've never seen those types of shades before." Lumi struggled up and over the same trunk, her footing slipping before she caught herself. "I'm not even sure those were shades," she said as she dragged herself across. "I've never seen a shade burn in colored flames before." Ragnar pressed his snout up beneath Lumi's skirt as she hesitated at the edge, giving her an unceremonious shove that lifted her over the log, and he followed with an easy hop of his own. Lumi stumbled forward and caught herself, shooting him a brief look before exhaling. Turning back as she continued walking, Lizyra glanced over her shoulder. "Furafay, how come you don't fly around as much like Adele? It'd be a lot."
Something didn't flow right
Lumi
right
struggled
there.
up and over the same trunk, her footing slipping before she caught herself. "I'm not even sure those were shades," she said as she dragged herself across. "I've never seen a shade burn in colored flames before." Ragnar pressed his snout up beneath Lumi's skirt as she hesitated at the edge, giving her an unceremonious shove that lifted her over the log, and he followed with an easy hop of his own. Lumi stumbled forward and caught herself, shooting him a brief look before exhaling. Turning back as she continued walking, Lizyra glanced over her shoulder. "Furafay, how come you don't fly around as much like Adele? It'd be a lot easier for you," she asked while stepping through a tangle of low branches. A faint flush crept across Lumi's face as she brushed leaves from her cloak. "I don't know why," she said, avoiding Lizyra's gaze for a moment. "But I just don't have the same kind of mana reserve Adele does. Flying all the time gets exhausting, and people can see up my tunic when I do." She grimaced slightly before adding, "I only really fly when I absolutely have to, or when I'm trying to avoid stepping in something disgusting." Lizyra pushed through the last of the brush, stepping back onto the cobblestone road as she glanced ahead. "If you spent more time in your imp form, you'd probably have more mana and could learn more magical abilities," she said, her tone more thoughtful than critical. Lumi's expression tightened as she followed through the same gap in the brush. "Don't you think I know that?" she said, irritation slipping through as she brushed past a branch. "I just don't feel like myself in that form." The words hung between them longer than expected, and as they both stepped fully onto the road, that tension dissolved into something colder. They stopped. Where the lone horse and carriage had stood bloody. The word, Lumi's expression tightened as she followed through the same gap in the brush. "Don't you think I know that?" she said, irritation The words hung between them longer than expected, and as they both stepped fully onto the road, that tension dissolved into something colder. Where the lone horse and carriage had stood bloody, torn, and impossible to ignore, there was nothing now. No wagon. There was nothing. Where the lone horse and carriage had stood bloodied, torn, and impossible to ignore, there was nothing now. Where the lone horse and carriage had stood bloodied, torn, and impossible to ignore, there was nothing now. No wagon. No wagon. No horse. Not even disturbed.
What the fuck's the font on this? Why does it keep turning it to 12 on the other side?
Where the lone horse and carriage had stood bloodied, torn, and impossible to ignore, there was nothing now. No wagon. No horse. Not even disturbed earth to suggest it had ever been there.
Don't know why you stopped
There.
and why the
Osyra stared at the
program's,
empty
like,
stretch
fucking
of
up
road,
recently.
her brow furrowing as unease crept in. Okay, she said slowly, glancing from one side of the road to the other, were they not in the forest and actually on the opposite side or something, and we just missed them? Lumi turned, scanning the road behind them before looking back. We were literally only gone for 10 to 15 minutes, she said, her voice lowering as the wrongness of it settled in. An uncertain smile tugged at Osyra's mouth as she folded her arms loosely. As long as they went and got help for whatever they were going through, all should be well, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. She glanced down both directions again. I guess those lantern shades had nothing to do with them. Lumi shook her head faintly, though doubt lingered in her eyes. I don't really know, she said, drawing in a breath before stepping forward. I don't really know, she said, drawing in a breath before stepping forward. Lumi shook her head faintly. I don't really know, she said, drawing in a breath before stepping forward. But I don't want to stand around here and find out. For all we know, more of those lantern ghosts could show up. They made their way down the road toward the caravan, passing the last wagon car before angling toward the deck of the first. Osyra slipped her foot beneath the edge and pressed the hidden lever, and with a sharp mechanical click, the ladder rungs slid outward from the wagon's side. Climbing quickly, she called out, "Hey! You're never going to believe what happened." She hauled herself up and swung over the guardrail, but the words died in her throat. Onyx sat on the deck floor, bound tight with rope, his arms wrenched behind his back as he looked up at her with wide, glassy eyes. "You're never going to believe who's robbing us right now," he said, his voice strained as he shifted against the restraints. Osyra dropped to her knees beside him, already reaching for the dagger tucked into her boot as she sliced through the rope. "What the hell happened while we were gone?" she demanded, her pulse spiking as she worked him free. Lumi vaulted over the guardrail behind her, landing lightly as she straightened and looked between them. "What did we miss?" she asked, her gaze snapping toward the cabin. The door behind them creaked open, and all three turned at once. A woman stepped Lumi vaulted over the guardrail behind her, landing lightly as she straightened and looked between them. "What did we miss?" she asked. The door behind them creaked open, and all three turned at once. A woman stepped out into the torchlight, her short silver-white hair framing her face as her polished white armor caught the flickering glow of the flames along the deck. A hooded white cape trailed behind her, brushing faintly against the wood as her armored boots rang out with each step. In her hand, she carried a heavy bag that clinked softly with coin and metal. Osyra's breath caught as recognition struck her like a blow. "Avery," she said, disbelief bleeding into her voice. With her mouth half full of whatever she had been eating from the caravan's storage, the woman blinked at them as if nothing were out of place. "Oh, hey guys," she said casually, still chewing. Staggered forward a step, Lumi's expression cracked as anger and confusion surged together. "What the fuck is going on?" she shouted, her voice breaking at the edges. "You're supposed to be dead." The woman tilted her head slightly, genuinely puzzled. "I am?" she asked, her tone light and unbothered. Lizyra rose slowly, her grip tightening around her dagger as she pointed toward the bag. "And why in the hells did you tie Onyx up?" she demanded, her stance shifting as tension coiled through her body. Lumi continued pressing forward, her eyes searching the woman's face. "Was that your wagon with the creepy horse?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Onyx pushed himself to his feet, snatching up his warhammer as he planted himself between them and the figure. "As much as I want it to be, that isn't Avery," he said, his voice hardening as he leveled the weapon toward her. "There's some kind of illusionist at foot, or someone's pulling a nasty prank." Lizyra's gaze flicked past the woman's shoulder, catching the unmistakable hilt of Chronos rising above her shield. "I mean, she has Chronos," she said, uncertainty creeping in despite herself. "Could it really be her?" Without lowering his weapon, Onyx shook his head. "It has to be a fake," he said, tightening his grip. "Chronos is safe back in one of Adel's temporal storage dimensions. I put it there myself." He extended the hammer fully now, pointing it squarely at her. "It's over, Spectre," he said with a grim steadiness. "Revert to your true form, and we'll generously end it quickly for you." Lizyra's attention snapped back to the bag in the woman's hand as coins shifted within it. "Hey," she shouted, anger cutting through her hesitation. "What are you doing with our coin?" Avery glanced down at the sack hanging from her hand and lifted it slightly as if seeing it for the first time. "This?" she asked, her tone light as she licked each finger of her other hand clean. "A donation for the church," she added with a faint uncertainty that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Shut up!" Onyx barked as he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the moment with raw conviction. "You might look like Avery and have her voice, but you could never mimic her mannerisms or the way she spoke," he said while letting his warhammer slip from his grasp. It struck the deck with a heavy clang as he reached beneath his cloak, pulling free a pair of dragon steel knuckles from a hidden pocket and sliding them over his hands. The hammer rolled slightly across the wood as he squared his stance and bared his teeth. "I'm going to fuck you up," he said, his voice dropping low as he coiled to strike. He launched forward in a burst of motion, one fist drawn back behind his head as he committed fully to the attack. "Oh well," Avery said with a small shrug of her shoulders. "It was worth a shot," she added, her tone shifting just enough to feel wrong. Before Onyx could close the distance, she moved. The sack dropped from her hand as she spun sharply on her heel, her kite shield snapping into place along her arm in the same motion. The edge of it slammed into Onyx mid-lunge with brutal force, driving him down into the deck hard enough to rattle the wood beneath.
With brutal force. The sack. Gotta get in the flask. Check. Yeah, okay, I got that. I got it written down. Okay, so both sides are edited. It's gonna fucking crash out. Oh, it didn't.
Driving, the sack
Right.
dropped from her hand as she spun sharply on her heel, her kite shield snapping into place along her arm in the same motion. The edge of it slammed into Onyx mid-lunge, driving him down into the deck hard enough to rattle the wood beneath him. A groan tore from him as he twisted, using the momentum to swing his legs outward. His boots caught her stance and tore it out from under her, sending her crashing down toward him. Avery braced herself at the last instant, both hands slamming against the deck on either side of his head, her face hovering inches from his. Onyx reacted instantly, wrapping both arms around her waist and locking her in place as he clenched tight. "Now," he shouted, his voice strained with effort. "Someone, deliver the final blow and kill her." Lumi stood frozen, her sword trembling in her grip as her breath hitched in her chest. I don't know if I can, she said, her voice quivering as doubt rooted her in place. She glanced toward Lizyra, searching for resolve, and felt her stomach drop. Lizyra lay flat on her back across the deck, her limbs pinned by a writhing cluster of elongated, ghostly black arms that phased up through the wood as if the wagon itself had turned against her. One of the hands clamped tightly over her mouth, muffling her struggle as she writhed beneath their grip. Lumi stared in horror, her throat tightening as Lizyra let out a strangled squeal beneath the smothering hand. Avery twisted violently in Onyx's hold, her body straining as she snapped her head back and shouted, "Vi!" The command struck like a whip. The caravan lurched forward as one of the ghostly arms snaked across the deck and yanked the brake lever free near the driver's throne. The horses surged into motion, dragging the entire line of wagons forward down the road. The sudden jolt tore Lumi off balance, her footing slipping as the deck shifted beneath her. She stumbled backward, catching her heel on the dropped sack before crashing down hard rear first straight onto Onyx's face. Avery wrenched her head aside in the same instant, slipping free from Onyx's grip as Lumi's weight smothered him. She rolled cleanly to her feet and lunged for the fallen pouch, snatching it up with urgency only for her movement to halt abruptly. A sharp, broken scream ripped from her throat. She dropped the sack as she clutched at her hand, staggering as pain overtook her. Her gaze snapped toward Lizyra, who had twisted her head just enough to sink her teeth deep into the ghostly hand covering her mouth. The moment her teeth closed, the spectral limb reacted. The black arms dissolved into smoke all at once, unraveling into nothing but not before something solid fell away. Two severed fingers, a pinky and ring finger, tumbled across the deck, slick with blood as they rolled to a stop. Crimson sprayed across the planks as Avery staggered back, clutching the mangled stumps with her remaining hand. "You little bitch," she snarled, her voice shifting into something deeper, harsher, unmistakably male. "You bit off me fucking fingers," they roared, the disguise cracking with every word. Lizyra pushed herself up onto her feet, black residue smeared across her lips and chin as she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "That tastes like shit," she spat, her voice sharp with disgust. Without hesitating, she reached into her pouch and tore free a glowing arcanix swirling with red and orange light. She swapped it with the existing one from her bow, replacing it in a single fluid motion before drawing the string back without an arrow in hand. As the string tightened, raw magic gathered. A burning arrow of spiraling energy formed between her fingers, coiling with heat and light as it screamed to life. She released it in the same breath, the projectile tearing across the deck before detonating against Avery's chest in a violent burst that hurled her backward through the cabin door. Wood splintered as Avery's body crashed inside, slamming across the floor. Lumi rolled off Onyx and scrambled upright, snatching her sword as she bolted toward the open doorway. Behind her, Onyx groaned as he pushed himself up, rubbing at his face with a grimace. "Fucking hells, how did she know the command for the horses?" he muttered, his voice thick with pain and confusion. Lizyra crouched briefly, scooping up the severed fingers and dropping them into her pouch alongside her arcanix. "I don't know," she said as she rose, her eyes narrowing toward the cabin. "But for a second, that sounded like a man." Lumi reached the doorway and pushed it open with the edge of her dragon steel short sword, her posture tightening as she called into the dim interior. "There's no way out back there unless you know how to open the doors properly," she said while stepping forward. The sound of shattering glass cracked through the cabin, followed by the low, violent growl of Ragnus as something thrashed against the floorboards. A man's raw and panicked voice rose into a series of broken cries. Lumi surged down the steps, her grip tightening on her blade as she reached the bottom and found Avery sprawled across the floor, writhing as Ragnus clamped down on her ankles and tore at her with relentless force. "Damn mutt," they cried in a male voice, the sound warped and wrong as it clawed its way out of Avery's throat, and she said, "I thought I locked you in the back." Lumi leveled her sword at him, the blade held steady despite the chaos, and she said, "Cut the shit. Drop our dead comrade's face and reveal yourself." The doppelganger cupped its bleeding hand, fingers trembling faintly as though pain was an afterthought to its own amusement, and it said, "I'm only who you want to see. I don't choose the faces." Ragnus lunged without hesitation and tore into their ankles, her teeth punching through flesh and and tore into their ankles, her teeth punching through flesh and sinking deep until the resistance of bone pressed back against her bite. Footsteps thundered down the stairs behind them as Onyx surged into the room, moving straight for the wolf as tension coiled through the air, and he snapped, "Heal." Ragnas obeyed with a low, reluctant growl as she withdrew and retreated to the side, while Onyx seized Avery by the collar of their chest plate and hauled them off the floor before driving his dragon steel-knuckled fist into their face again and again, each blow landing with a wet, splintering crack as cartilage and bone gave way beneath the force. Blood slicked his hand as the strikes continued, and the borrowed flesh began to betray its shape as Avery's skin hissed and peeled, sloughing away in burning sheets while the body beneath lost cohesion, collapsing inward as if it were no longer made of flesh but of ash barely holding form. Armor and cloth decayed with it, crumbling into dust that scattered across the floorboards, and through it all a voice threaded itself through the cabin, calm and amused as it carried into every corner of the wagon car, and it said, "Fools. Consumed by such hatred and anger, and it inexorably blinds you." Onyx cast the collapsing form aside and stormed back onto the deck, his gaze sweeping the road and Trilene as tension sharpened his posture, and he shouted, "Show yourself, Spectre. Stop hiding behind games." Above him, from the broken scaffolding, a cloaked figure dropped without warning, driving a precise kick toward his head as the air split around the motion. His blood-slick forearm snapped up in time to catch the strike, and his free hand seized the cloak and wrenched the figure downward before slamming them into the deck hard enough to rattle the wood beneath their feet, but the body burst apart into smoke on impact and reformed above him in the same breath.
Excuse me. You know what? No, excuse me. You're welcome. How about that? Every time I'm going to fucking belch, I'm going to say you're welcome.
His blood-slick forearm snapped up in time to catch the strike, and his free hand seized the cloak and wrenched the figure downward before slamming them into the deck hard enough to splinter the planks beneath their feet, but the body burst apart into smoke on impact and reformed above him in the same breath, already descending again in a second strike. Lizyra burst through the cabin door with her bow already drawn as magic coiled along the string, shaping itself into an arrow that hummed with contained force, while Lumi rushed in behind her and cut through the moment sharply, and she said, "Wait." The arrow unraveled into drifting light as Lizyra eased the tension in her draw, though her posture remained tight and ready to snap again at a moment's notice, and she said, "What?" Lumi stepped between them, her eyes locked onto the shifting figure as it flickered. "What?" Lumi stepped between them, her eyes locked onto the shifting figure as it flickered in and out of solidity. Lumi stepped between them, her eyes locked. The arrow unraveled into drifting light as Lizyra eased the tension in her draw, though her posture remained tight and ready to snap again at a moment's notice, and she asked, "What?" Lumi stepped between them, her eyes locked onto the shifting figure as it flickered in and out of solidity, and she said, "Don't kill him." Before another word could take shape, a green, whip-like tail lashed out from beneath the cloak and snapped around Lizyra's bow, wrenching it clean from her grip and dragging it out of sight beneath the fabric. Onyx lunged into the struggle as they collided across the deck, boots scraping and bodies straining for leverage while he fought to keep hold of the weapon, His teeth clenched as fury bled into his voice, and he snarled, "You slippery fuck." The cloak finally tore back under the strain, revealing a younger man beneath with green skin stretched over sharp features, short jet black hair clinging in uneven strands, and two small gray horns just barely breaking through, while his red eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Onyx stared at him as recognition flickered into place, and he said, "Avert devil." Soot-black spectral arms erupted from the deck around them, twisting upward like smoke as they reached to bind Onyx in place, while the vert devil clawed desperately at the bow still caught between them, intent on tearing it free. The struggle broke apart when Lizyra drove her boot into the man's face, the impact snapping his head sideways and sending his body spinning into the guardrail where it struck hard and went limp. The spectral arms unraveled into nothing as their form collapsed, and Onyx pushed himself upright while wiping the blood from his knuckles, breath still heavy with the remnants of the fight, and he said, "Not the kind of specter I expected." Lizyra retrieved her bow and checked its grip before settling it back into her hands, her gaze lingering on the unconscious body as understanding hardened her tone, and she said, "That's not a specter at all. That's a vert devil. A young one at that." Her attention shifted as she looked down at the white-skinned severed fingers still clutched in her grasp, and she paused as something unnatural crept across them, the color bleeding into a sickly green as realization set in, and she said, "What the hell? They're green now." Onyx glanced over at her hand, and asked, "What are you going to do with those?" Without answering at first, she crossed the deck in quick, deliberate strides and seized the devil's hand before forcing the Without answering at first, she crossed the deck quickly and seized the devil's hand before forcing the severed fingers somewhat back into place, bone grinding against bone as she pressed them into the stumps with grim resolve, then uncorked a red potion and poured it over the wound in controlled bursts as the liquid hissed against the Without answering at first, she crossed the deck quickly and seized the devil's hand before forcing the severed fingers somewhat back into place, then uncorked a red potion and poured it over the wound in controlled bursts as the liquid hissed against the torn flesh. Onyx stepped closer, watching the process with disbelief edged in his voice, and he said, "Why are you reattaching their fingers? They just tried to rob and kill us." She continued pouring the potion, her focus unbroken as her grip held the hand steady, and she said, "Because this bastard is our prisoner now, and I don't want him bleeding out before he wakes up, so I can rip his testicles off and shove them in his mouth for mimicking Avery." Lumi slid her sword back into its sheath, the tension in her posture easing only slightly as her gaze remained fixed on the unconscious devil, and she said, "He said while we were in the cabin that he didn't choose the faces." Onyx let out a sharp scoff as he shook his head, dismissing the claim without hesitation, and he said, "Yeah, right. That little shit knew exactly what he was doing." Lizyra rose to her feet as she finished sealing the wound, her hand lifting as she gave the command for the horses to halt, and the wagon began to slow as the wheels ground against the dirt beneath them, and she said, "Ragnar's probably still out there following the caravan. I hope he's okay." A low mutter broke through the lingering tension as Onyx glanced toward the tree lean, jaw still tight from the fight, and he said, "He's a damn dire wolf. He could follow this thing for days if..." A low mutter broke through the lingering tension as Onyx glanced toward the tree lean. "He's a damn dire wolf. He could follow this thing for days if he had to." Lumi stepped back into the cabin with purpose already driving her movements, reaching for supplies as she said, "I'm going to get magic nullifying restraints. If we use rope, he's going to start pulling tricks the moment he wakes up." The sack of coin and scavenged valuables was lifted from the floor, and Onyx weighed it in his hand like it personally offended him before he said, "I don't see why we don't just feed him to Ragnar and Ragnus before he wakes up." Lizyra turned toward him, studying the anger sitting just beneath his surface, and asked, "Don't you want answers? Who he is, where he came from, and who sent him?" He loosened the sack just enough to peer inside, the faint glint of coin catching in his eyes as his expression hardened, and Onyx said, "No. He's a petty thief. No one sent him other than his own greed. He came from nowhere I care about. He used Avery's face like a mask, and I'd rather see him rot in the ground than wake up again." When Lumi returned, rope and magic nullifying iron cuffs hung from her hands, and she suggested, "Onyx, I suggest you go inside and cool off. If you kill him, it'd be murder since he's already been subdued." He brushed past her toward the door, shoulder clipping the frame as irritation bled through the motion, and Onyx muttered, "Using the last of our healing potions on his ass." Lizyra took the rope as Lumi moved in with the cuffs, and together they forced the unconscious man's arms behind his back, tightening each binding until there was no slack left, and Lizyra asked, "Do you think he had anything to do with those shades or the carriage?" The final knot cinched down hard, and she gave the restraint a firm tug before adding, "I don't know, but he's got a lot of explaining to do." Wooden planks creaked and groaned as Lumi grabbed the man by one leg and dragged him across the deck, hauling him inside. His head struck each step on the way down with dull, jarring thuds as they descended into the cabin while Onyx opened the side door to the outside. Claws tapped against the wooden floor moments later as Ragnar charged in joining Ragnus, but Lumi's voice cut through their momentum sharply as she said, "Sit." Both wolves dropped into place at once, though tension still coiled through their bodies as they watched the bound figure, while Lumi dragged a chair beneath the overhead storage and climbed up just as the wagon gave a sudden, violent shudder. From the doorway leading out to the deck above, Lizyra's voice called down, edged with urgency as she said, "You guys might want to get up here." Lumi dropped from the chair and rushed out, pushing onto the deck before stopping dead in her tracks. Just in time to see the earth ahead split open. The road cracked with a deep, grinding roar as the ground tore apart, and from within that rupture a massive white hand of bone forced its way upward, each finger thick as a pillar. Another followed beside it, both vast enough to lift a carriage as though it weighed nothing while the land groaned under the strain. Then a skull emerged. It dragged itself up from the broken earth like something waking from an age-long grave, swallowing the road beneath it as it rose. Its immense form loomed against the sky, and the clouds above it began to part, slowly revealing the eclipse behind them. Lumi froze for a heartbeat as disbelief overtook her, and she groaned, "You've got to be fucking kidding me."
Alright, chapter 36, there's like 2 more left. Gotta take a hit, get a drink, and see what my phone is in. 100%. And it turned on. What the fuck? I got everything set up. It's ready to go. Alright. So many mistakes. So much dumb bullshit. I'll never be ready in my mind. But that's just the way it goes. Alright, I'm gonna get my model up real quick. Hopefully I can do it before the song ends. Screen copy. Open a terminal here. Plug in the phone, because every time it resets, you have to go back into developer mode and turn the Wi-Fi debugging mode on. Because for some reason it doesn't turn on automatically, even though I've said it 1,000 times. Whoa, I'm a liar, it's on. I swear it's never done that before. Why am I lying like that? Turn power saving mode on, turn the screen down, launch the Realty app, open up a notepad. Oh, it's already open. Okay, get to the first page, copy the thing, don't paste it in the chat. I've done that before and that was bad. I had to end stream and then change a bunch of shit. Oh wait, it worked first try. Whoa, what's happening? Are we streaming? Am I live right now? This never works like this. We're almost there. I can't believe it. And go.
Chapter 36. It That Betrays. Vert D/Nizera/30/Y997/6th Age, Dusk Tide. B. Beneath a low, suffocating sky the color of wet ash, rows of massive dragon steel artillery cannons loomed in silence, their long black barrels angled toward the heavens as if awaiting judgment rather than command, each one fixed in place along the stone fortifications of N'Zoth and poised to unleash ruin upon whatever dared approach from beyond its walls. Overhead, the clouds sagged heavy and fractured, split by veins of distant lightning that never quite reached the ground, as though the sky itself had already wept dry and now hung in a state of exhausted mourning for the thousands gathered below. Across the scorched fields and the blackened outskirts of what had once been thriving settlements beyond the city's fortifications, 10,000 soldiers stood locked in formation, their ranks stretching outward in grim symmetry around the harbor city, while another 4,000 moved in restless purpose behind them, raising tents that would likely never be slept in, tending to siege engines that would soon scream to life, and rotating through the lines with the hollow efficiency of people who understood exactly what waited for them. Beyond the walls, the harbor waters lay choked with war vessels, no fewer than 100 freighters of varying class, their hulls carved with the seal of Aurelier and their sails marked in proud defiance of the storm that threatened to break above them. Every crewman stood at their station without a word, their hands resting on ropes, weapons, or rails, their silence not born of discipline alone but of the tension that settled in the chest before looming violence on this scale. Yet what mirrored those living ranks proved far more unsettling. Alongside the Aurelian formations stood regiments that did not breathe, did not shift, and did not falter. Humes, demi-humes, and beastmen alike stood shoulder to shoulder mirroring their living counterparts among the battlefield, their eyes, for those who still possessed them, glazed in a dim, unnatural glow of purplish-pink haze that pulsed faintly beneath the gloom. Trolls, goblins, hobgoblins, and other twisted remnants of once living creatures stood eerily silent and unmoving behind their ranks. High above it all, suspended in quiet defiance of gravity, a single airship hovered over the royal castle like a predator waiting for its prey. The Diablos, a behemoth-class battle cruiser, hung unnaturally in the sky, its mana engines humming beneath the thickening clouds, the sound rolling across the fields in a low, resonant vibration that settled deep into bone. Shaped in the image of a seafaring vessel, its massive hull of dragonwood and steel loomed with oppressive weight, its port and starboard sides flanked by rigid, unmoving, demonic-like wings that stretched outward in silent menace. At the base of one section of N'Zoth's fortified walls, where dozens of cannons sat dormant and slick with damp air, a lone man knelt in the mud with his shoulders hunched and his focus narrowed to something far smaller than the war surrounding him. A rat darted in frantic, erratic patterns at his feet, its tiny claws scratching lines into the wet earth as it circled, doubled back, and cut sharp angles that, to an untrained eye, would have seemed meaningless. To him, however, every movement carried significance. With a torn sheet of parchment balanced across one knee, he followed the creature's path as best he could, sketching crude lines and marking intersections as the rat traced its route again and again, until the chaos beneath his hand began to take form of something more legible. After a moment, he leaned back slightly and studied what he had drawn, then glancing down at the animal he asked, "And you're sure?" The question carried less doubt than fatigue, as though certainty itself had become a luxury. The rat paused its pacing, letting out a series of sharp squeaks before circling one particular cluster of prints with deliberate insistence, then rising onto its hind legs as if to emphasize the point. Exhaling slowly, the man pushed himself upright and extended the parchment to a nearby soldier, the rough map marked with hastily scrawled coordinates and annotations. "Prepare the cannons," he said, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. "If anything goes sour, these are our new targets." The soldier snapped a quick salute and hurried off without question, vanishing into the line of artillery as the rat resumed its restless noise at the man's feet. Catching himself mid-step, the man let out a quiet breath and dropped back into a crouch, muttering, "I almost forgot," as he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled free a small chunk of cheese already softened by age, one edge spotted with creeping mold. He tossed it gently to the rat, watching as it seized the offering without hesitation, and said, "If it weren't for the Aurelian and undead forces starving us out this past week, I'd have more to offer, but I'm afraid that's the last of what I had." The soldier snapped a quick salute and hurried off without question, vanishing into the line of artillery as the rat resumed its restless noise at the man's feet. Catching himself mid-step, the man let out a quiet breath and dropped back into a crouch, muttering, "I almost forgot," as he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled free a small chunk of cheese already softened by age, one edge spotted with creeping mold. He tossed it gently to the rat, watching as it seized the offering, and said, "If it weren't for the Aurelian and undead forces starving us out this past week, I'd have more to offer, but I'm afraid that's the last of what I had." Rising again, his hand settled instinctively on the hilt of his sword as his gaze lifted toward the towering walls above him, tracing their height as they rose over the city's inner structures. "I doubt the king will agree to their terms," he added after a moment, his tone flattening as he measured the darkening sky. And with the sun slipping away, his voice trailed briefly before returning with a faint, grim finality. "Tonight looks like the night we die." He lingered there for a heartbeat longer, eyes fixed on stone and shadow, before finishing under his breath, "On empty stomachs." Behind him, the rat sat quietly, nibbling at the cheese without concern for its condition, starting with the mold-softened edge as if hunger had long since stripped away preference. The small, steady sound of its eating filled the space between them until a solo drop of rain finally broke from the sky, striking the ground beside it with a soft, darkening mark. The man turned back to his task without another word, bending to grip the heavy lever at the base of the nearest cannon. Muscles tightening beneath his armor, he forced the mechanism into motion, and the gears answered with a low, grinding groan as the barrel shifted ever so slightly, adjusting its aim with reluctant precision. Moving down the line, he repeated the process at the next cannon, then the next, each adjustment deliberate despite the creeping fatigue in his limb.
I feel like I'm about to have an explosive case of diarrhea or something. Let's hope that goes away.
Moving down, the man turned back to his task without another word, bending to grip the heavy lever at the base of the nearest cannon. Muscles tightening beneath his armor, he forced the mechanism into motion, and the gears answered with a low, grinding groan as the barrel shifted ever so slightly, adjusting its aim. Moving down the line, he repeated the process at the next cannon, then the next, each adjustment deliberate despite the creeping fatigue in his limbs, until a flicker of movement behind him drew his attention.
Bada bing, bada boom. Every time I save now, like, Word acts like it's gonna crash. I mean, all I'm doing is like losing words at this point, trying to cut down page numbers, and it shouldn't be tripping out like this.
Despite the moving down, the man turned back to his task without another word, bending to grip the heavy lever at the base of the nearest cannon. Muscles tightening beneath his armor, he forced the mechanism into motion, and the gears answered with a low, grinding groan as the barrel shifted ever so slightly, adjusting its aim. Moving down the line, he repeated the process at the next cannon, then the next, despite the creeping fatigue in his limbs, until a flicker of movement behind him drew his attention. When he glanced back, the rat had vanished into whatever cracks or shadows it had come from, leaving behind only half the cheese and a single, tiny handprint pressed into the mud beside it. Another drop of rain struck the abandoned piece, then another, darkening its surface as the man stared at it for a moment longer than necessary before turning away again, setting his hands to the next set of levers as the distant sky continued to rumble. Through the churned mixture of mud and broken cobblestone, a white Clydesdale pushed forward at a steady, deliberate trot, its legs armored from the knees up in plates dulled by grime and weather, each step sending a wet crunch beneath its weight. Seated upon it, a broad-shouldered man with long black curls threaded faintly with gray at the roots, kept his posture upright despite the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, a long dark steel bardic resting in a harness across his back beneath the fall of his cloak. Behind him, a formation of roughly 100 soldiers advanced in disciplined silence, some bearing crossbows already strung and ready, others gripping swords and spears with the tight restraint of men waiting for orders they already understood would end in blood. Ahead, the city responded to their approach with a grinding protest of ancient mechanisms as the drawbridge began its descent, its chains tightening and gears groaning from within the fortified walls while the gate above lifted into its stone housing. No voice rose to greet them, no signal of welcome or warning, only the steady, oppressive quiet of a city that had already begun to accept its fate. When the far edge of the bridge finally settled across the moat into its stone grooves, the knight pressed his heels lightly into the horse's flanks and led his company across, the gulf-fed waters below shifting darkly beneath them. On the opposite side, the vast expanse of gathered forces stretched outward in a grim horizon, and from among them another figure emerged to meet his advance. Adrienne Dravarin rode forward astride a horse as black as the robes that draped her form, its presence almost swallowing the dim light around them, while beside her moved a hooded figure whose gait carried a quiet, predatory ease. Trailing just behind them rode an elderly Hume upon a brown and white steed, his age betrayed only by the silver threaded through his hair and beard, for his posture remained rigid, his shoulders broad, and the tension in his frame spoke less of frailty than of a man starved for battle rather than worn by it. A blue and white cape streamed behind him, snapping faintly in the unsettled air as the three came to a halt midway between the city walls and the outer ranks of the Clydesdale Knights Company. The distance between the two groups settled into a charged stillness before Adrienne broke it, her voice carrying cleanly across the field as she called, "Has your Majesty finally come to his senses and offered his surrender?" The question held no expectation, only a thinly veiled impatience. Without haste, the man atop the Clydesdale dismounted, dropping into the muck below as his boots sank slightly into the softened mud as he reached up and lifted the visor of his great helm, revealing a face set in quiet resolve as he answered, "Unfortunately not," his tone steady despite what lingered behind it. A faint scoff slipped from Adrienne as she turned her mount with a sharp pull of the reins, already dismissing the exchange as she guided the horse back toward her lines while saying, "Such a shame. N'Zoth was one of the closest nations under Enos. It will only bring me pain to watch it, and her people burn, her words carrying a detached cruelty that settled uneasily in the air. As she began to withdraw, the knight's voice rose again, cutting through the distance with unexpected urgency as he called, "I come with a different proposal, unbeknownst to the king." His words drew the faintest shift in her posture, though she did not slow immediately. "Why would I entertain a proposal?" Adrian asked without turning, her voice edged with irritation, "from a traitorous nation whose reinforcements stood idle while we burned instead of answering the call." "Because," he replied, the force behind the word carrying across the field as he stepped forward a pace, "there are more civilians behind those walls than soldiers standing out here, people who have nothing to do with any of this. Some of them once belonged to Enos before they fled here seeking refuge." His voice tightened, not with desperation but with conviction as he continued, "Lich or not, if you truly are Adrian Dravarinth, then you owe them at least the courtesy of hearing me out." The reins in her hand stilled. After a moment, her horse came to a stop, and without turning to face him she said, "Speak," the single word measured and restrained. Drawing a breath, the man steadied himself before saying, "We settle this with a single duel, selecting one chosen champion from each side. If your warrior wins, we surrender regardless of the king's decree. If ours prevails, you withdraw, returning to whatever dark force sent you, and never set foot in N'Zoth again." The proposal hung between them, heavy with its own impossibility. Adrian sat with it in silence for a moment, her gaze fixed ahead before she asked, "Convince me. Why betray your king's command?" Her tone shifted, not mockingly, but probing, as though the answer itself mattered more than the offer. "Because fuck the king," he said, the restraint finally breaking as anger bled into his voice. "I fight for the people of N'Zoth, and he's lost his way. He hoards what food remains for himself and his court while the rest of the kingdom starves waiting to die. He chose this prolonging of suffering, not us." The words came rough, unpolished, but carried with them a truth that lingered in the silence that followed. For a few breaths, Adrian said nothing. Then, at last, she spoke. 10 minutes, she said, her voice calm once more. "Choose your strongest warrior and return here prepared to fight." "There's no need," he answered immediately. With a sharp motion, he tore the cloak from his shoulders and cast it aside, revealing the full length of the dark steel bardic as he pulled it free from its harness and brought it down into his grip, both hands settling along its shaft as he planted its weight against the ground before him. "I will be that warrior," he said, his voice steady despite the risk he had just claimed. A slow smile curved across Adrienne's lips as she turned fully and dismounted and began to approach him, her gaze dragging over his form with open curiosity. "You don't say," she murmured, studying him before adding, "you do realize that if you die here, no one will remember your name. No songs, no stories, nothing to mark whatever you think this sacrifice will be." A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, something caught between defiance and the quiet acceptance of what stood before him as he replied, "Then it's a good thing I don't plan on dying tonight," his grip tightening slightly on the bardic as he added, "especially not with the lunar event so close." The amusement in her expression deepened, something almost genuine slipping through as she said, "I don't know what it is about you, but I like you." After a brief pause, her head tilted slightly as she asked, "What was your name again?" "Sir Rex Admundistar," he answered, holding her gaze without flinching. For just a moment, something in her expression shifted, as if the name brushed against a memory she couldn't quite grasp, before it vanished beneath her usual composure. "Very well then," she said, her tone returning to something lighter, almost dismissive, as she finished, "Felix, kill him." Before the words had fully settled, the cloaked figure at her side moved. In a single fluid motion, Felix launched himself upward, his cloak flaring as his arm snapped outward, and from within its folds a storm of kunao spilled into the air, fanning wide before descending in a lethal barrage toward Rex. The ground erupted in small bursts of mud as the first blades struck, but Rex was already in motion, pivoting sharply as a second wave of kunao littered the ground behind him, his bardic sweeping in a controlled arc that deflected those aimed too close while his footwork carried him cleanly through the rest, as the rain of steel buried itself harmlessly into the earth around him. Thunder rolled across the bruised sky as Felix struck the ground in a controlled somersault, the wet grass and mud kicking up around him while the horizontal sweep of Rex's bardic carved through the space where his torso had just been. Carrying that momentum through his landing, Felix came up low and forward, already drawing a dagger as he stepped into Ryux's reach and drove the blade toward the narrow seam beneath the knight's raised arm, aiming for any vulnerable crease where his blade could slip through. The dagger scraped hard along reinforced plating, searching for purchase, but before it could bite, Ryux dropped his arm, trapping the blade between the reinforced armpit joint of his chest plate as he twisted through the motion, snapping the weapon's blade with a sharp, grinding crack before driving his elbow into Felix's face. The impact sent Felix skidding backward through slick mud, his body rolling twice before he caught himself, while a surge of voices rose from the surrounding soldiers, their cheers cutting through the tension as they reacted to the clean, punishing counter. Keeping his footing wide and grounded, Ryux adjusted his stance and leveled the bardic once more, its edge glistening with the faint rain and grime as he circled to his right, never letting Felix drift out of his sight. Across from him, Felix rose again, slower this time, dragging the back of his hand across his chin to wipe away mud and blood before resetting his grip. "Boy," Ryux said, his voice carrying across the tightening ring of onlookers as he shifted his weight forward, "just because my hair's starting to gray doesn't mean you should gamble everything on a killing blow as your first move," he added, the faint curl of a smirk looming at his lips as he rolled his shoulders, adjusting the weight of the weapon in his hands. Around them, the circle drew tighter as soldiers of both sides, living and dead alike, closed in with measured steps, weapons lowered in reluctant respect for the duel as murmurs and low cheers rippled through the crowd, their attention locked entirely on the clash unfolding at its center. Without answering, Felix slipped his second dagger free and reversed it in his grip, the blade angled along his forearm as he lunged again, faster and more deliberate, closing the distance in a blur of motion. Ryux met him head-on, pivoting on his heel and driving the butt of the bardic's shaft into Felix's midsection before continuing the rotation, his free hand catching the back of Felix's cloak as he redirected the momentum and hurled him hard onto his back. Felix hit the ground with a wet thud and rolled through it, grass and mud clinging to him as he sprang back to his feet in the same breath, already releasing one of his daggers in a sharp, snapping throw aimed straight for Ryux's head. Ryux knocked the blade aside with a quick flick of his weapon, but the motion came a fraction too late to account for the small black sphere trailing just behind it. The object struck the visor of his helm and burst on impact, releasing a dense plume of blackened soot and tar that forced its way through the eye slits and flooded his vision in an instant. A harsh cough tore from his throat as the world dissolved into choking darkness, the acrid grit burning into his eyes while he tore at his helm, ripping it free and flinging it aside before stripping off one gauntlet to claw at the muck. His vision swam and stung as he forced his eyes open against the pain, and through the haze, instinct pressed him to surge forward, demanding action before the moment slipped. Driving off his back foot, Ryux thrust the bardic into the smoke, the blade sweeping in a wide arc that cut through the space ahead of him. Felix slipped past its edge, planting briefly against the flat of the weapon before vaulting upward and inward. In the same motion, he drew a third blade, slightly longer, darker, and far more insidious in shape, and drove it toward Ryux's exposed throat. Ryux met the strike head-on, catching the blade in his bare hand and letting it drive through his palm and Ryux met the strike, catching the blade in his bare hand and letting it drive through his palm until it struck the guard, blood spilling instantly as steel pierced flesh. His fingers closed around it regardless, locking the weapon in place before he wrenched it free from Felix's grip and stepped forward into him, slamming his forehead into Felix's with a crack that echoed like thunder across the field. The force of it sent Felix hurtling backward, his body tumbling across the soaked ground as another thunderclap tore open the sky above them, louder this time, closer, as if the heavens themselves had split. A low, rising roar bled into existence beneath the storm, deep and wrong, carrying with it a pressure that pressed against the chest and rattled the bones. Soldiers faltered where they stood, their cheers dying in their throats as shadows twisted across the field. From above, cutting through the rain-laden clouds in a violent descent, a black dragon tore into view, its massive form crashing into the ground between Felix and Ryux with a concussive force that sent mud and water erupting outward in a wide ring. Its jaws were already open as it landed, the back of its throat glowing with a churning mass of blackened, miasmic magma that coiled and writhed unnaturally. Nex, enough. Felix commanded sharply as he forced himself upright, his voice cutting through the chaos with authority that did not waver. The dragon hesitated, the violent glow in its maw flickering as it closed its jaws with a reluctant snarl, turning its head toward him with a low, wounded whine that rumbled through the ground beneath them. "This is my fight," Felix continued, drawing in a breath as rain began to fall harder, soaking through his cloak while he steadied himself. "You can't keep interrupting every battle you weren't invited to," he added, his tone edged but controlled, as though this argument had been had before. The dragon screeched in protest, the sound tearing through the storm before it launched itself back into the sky with a powerful beat of its wings, vanishing once more into the roiling clouds above as the rain finally broke into a steady, relentless downpour. Water streamed down Felix's face as he reached up and pulled back his hood, revealing short brown hair plastered to his head and eyes streaked with crimson that seemed to catch the dim light even through the rain. He exhaled slowly, composure settling back over him as if the interruption had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice flattening into something almost devoid of inflection as he rolled his shoulders and reset his stance. "Damn dragon lets its feelings get in the way of everything," he added, flexing his grip around the remaining dagger. Across from him, Riex shook the last of the grit from his vision, blinking through the sting as rain washed blood from his hand, the wound still open and raw as it dripped steadily into the mud. He tightened his grip on the bardic regardless, grounding himself as he took in the sight of what had just descended before him. "You have a dragon at your disposal," Riex said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling beneath it as he shifted his footing, angling the blade once more toward Felix, "yet you choose not to use it here." "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. Felix bent slightly to retrieve the longer dagger from where Riex had discarded it, lifting it with a careful motion before turning it in his hand and settling into a guarded stance. "This is a battle between..." Sorry about that," he said, his voice flattening into something almost devoid of inflection as he rolled his shoulders and reset his stance. "Damn dragon lets its feelings get in the way of everything," he added. Across from him, Riex shook the last of the grit from his vision, blinking through the sting as rain washed blood from his hand, the wound still open and raw as it dripped steadily into the mud. He tightened his grip on the bardic regardless, grounding himself as he took in the sight of what had just descended before him. "You have a dragon at your disposal," Riex said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling beneath it as he shifted his footing, angling the blade once more toward Felix, "yet you choose not to use it here." "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. Felix bent slightly to retrieve the longer dagger from where Riex had discarded it, lifting it with a careful motion before turning it in his hand and settling into a guarded stance. "This is a battle between two warriors," Felix replied, rain trailing from his jaw as he spoke, his gaze fixed and unwavering. "My dragon isn't a tool, she's a partner, and turning this into two You have a dragon at your disposal, Ryux said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling beneath it as he shifted his footing, angling the blade once more toward Felix, yet you choose not to use it here. Why? He asked, genuinely curious. Felix bent slightly to retrieve the longer dagger from where Ryux had discarded it, lifting it with a careful motion before turning it in his hand and settling into a guarded stance. This is a battle between two warriors, Felix replied, rain trailing from his jaw as he spoke. My dragon isn't a tool, she's a partner, and turning this into 2 against 1 was never part of the agreement, he continued, adjusting his footing as he tested the slick ground beneath him. His eyes flicked briefly over Ryux, measuring him again, before he added, I've also noticed you haven't used any magic, so I've refrained from using any of mine, his tone matter of fact, as though the decision required no further explanation. Ryux studied him for a long moment, rain running down the lines of his face and through the strands of darkening hair. This is a battle between two warriors, Felix replied, rain trailing from his jaw as he spoke. My dragon isn't a tool, she's a partner, and turning this into 2 against 1 was never part of the agreement, he continued, adjusting his footing as he tested the slick ground beneath him. His eyes flicked briefly over Ryux, measuring him again, before he added, I've also noticed you seem devoid of magic, so I've refrained from using any of mine, his tone matter of fact, as though the decision required no further explanation. Ryux studied him for a long moment, rain running down the lines of his face and through the strands of darkening hair clinging to his temples, before a faint, humorless smile touched his lips. Honorable, Ryux said as he rolled his injured hand once, flexing through the pain while settling deeper into his stance, but foolish, he added, lifting the bardic slightly as his weight shifted forward again. I've bested many mages in my time, some of them grandmasters, and just because I don't wield magic doesn't mean I don't know how to fight against it, he finished, his voice low and certain as the distance between them seemed to shrink beneath the weight of what was about to come. From atop his horse, the Aurelian king let out a low, amused laugh that rolled easily from his chest despite the tension coiling across the field, while Adrienne turned her head toward him with visible disdain before flicking her gaze back to the duel and urging, on with it, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd, at the rate you two are going, you'll be courting each other by the time Luna erupts. Between them, Felix and Sir Ryux continued to circle, boots grinding into wet earth as rain thickened around them, their weapons held ready while the ring of soldiers pressed closer, jeers and taunts spilling from both sides in restless anticipation. The moment stretched on seamlessly as if ready to snap, until the sky itself seemed to fracture. A violent quake split the heavens as thunder did not merely sound but rolled downward into the earth, and in the same breath, a thunderous cadence erupted from behind the distant lines as dozens of dragon steel artillery cannons unleashed their fury into the storm-choked sky. The sound tore across the battlefield in layered waves, each report shaking the ground beneath their feet as fire and smoke belched upward in violent succession. Ryux's head snapped toward the city, the color draining from his face as realization struck him harder than any blade ever could. The bardic slipped from his grasp as his knees buckled beneath him, dropping him into the mud while disbelief hollowed out his voice. He's doomed us all, Ryux said, staring past the chaos as the first distant arcs of incoming fire began to crest against the sky. Adrienne's lips morbidly curled, more delighted than before as she lifted her staff slightly, her eyes reflecting the distant flashes of ignition somewhat hidden behind the city's fortified stone walls. It seems your king finally dragged himself from his throne, she said, almost gleeful as the air trembled with the oncoming barrage, and chose to make his move the moment he caught sight of Felix's dragon. A hollow, resigned weight settled into Ryux's chest as he remained where he had fallen, rain soaking through armor and cloth alike while the truth of it settled in. "I was a fool," he said, the words heavy and stripped of anything but bitter clarity, "and now I die at the hands of a madman," he added, his gaze fixed forward as the sky above them darkened with descending death. Adrienne's smile deepened, something cold and knowing threading through it as she tilted her head slightly. "What he doesn't know," she said, her tone lowering with quiet satisfaction, "is that negotiations have already taken place without his consent," she continued, her grip tightening on the staff, "and he isn't the king anymore." A shimmering blue veil flared into existence around her and several figures near her side, its surface rippling like liquid glass just as the first volley of artillery screamed downward. The shells struck with catastrophic force, detonating across the field in violent bursts that tore through ranks indiscriminately, shredding Aurelian soldiers, undead ranks, and Ryux's own men alike as fire and debris erupted outward in brutal waves. The ground convulsed beneath the impact as more volleys followed, one after another, raining down upon tents and supply lines behind the advancing forces where ammunition the ground convulsed beneath the impact as more volleys followed, one after another, raining down upon tents and supply lines behind the advancing forces where ammunition stores and unstable monoconstructs ignited in chain reactions that painted the battlefield in bursts of flame and ruptured energy. What had been a tense standoff shattered into chaos as regiments roared to life, the surviving soldiers surging forward in a desperate charge toward the city gates just as the drawbridge began its slow ascent. Yet before they could reach it, sections of the fortified wall on either side of the gate collapsed inward in controlled destruction, revealing hollowed interiors where rows of cannons and ballistae had already been positioned, their muzzles flashing as they fired directly into the advancing ranks. The blue veil around Adrian and the others flickered and dissipated as the barrage momentarily eased, revealing a grotesque sprawl of torn bodies and shattered armor littering the mud around them. Among that ruin, Ryux lay broken, his body twisted and struggling as he fought to drag himself upright, only to find that both of his legs ended in ruin at the knees while one of his gauntleted hands had been crushed into something unrecognizable. Blood spilled freely from his mouth and nose as each breath came ragged and wet, yet even through the agony, he forced his eyes up toward Adrian as if the weight of something unsaid demanded to be carried through. "The one," Ryux began, his voice faltering as another surge of blood choked the words from him before he forced them out again, "who first betrayed you," he continued, each syllable dragged through pain, "was one of your own, who now sits on the Imperial Senate," he finished, his head sagging as the effort drained what little strength remained. Adrian stepped closer, her boots sinking slightly into the blood-soaked earth as she looked down at him with a faint, almost playful curiosity. "Oh please," she said, tilting her head as though humoring a story, "do tell me more," she added, though her eyes searched him more carefully than her tone suggested. Ryux coughed hard, his body convulsing as he tried to draw breath through the flood rising in his throat. "I'm afraid I'm at the end," he said, his voice thinning as the world around him dimmed, "and even if I had more to give you, the next volley will be my last," he added, his gaze drifting past her for Ryux coughed hard, his body convulsing as he tried to draw breath through the flood rising in his throat. "I'm afraid I'm at the end," he said, his voice thinning as the world around him dimmed, "and even if I had more to give you, the next volley will be my last." His gaze drifting past her for a moment before finding its way back. "Just promise me, you'll take care of the people of N'Zoth." Adrian exhaled sharply through her nose, her expression shifting into something impatient. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she said, though she did not move away as the distant rumble of artillery began to build once more behind the walls. Another thunderous wave rolled across the battlefield as the cannons roared again, their fire arcing skyward in preparation for the next descent. Looking down at him, Adrienne's tone shifted as she asked, "Do you solemnly swear, on whatever god or idol you worship, that you will meet the needs of the citizens of N'Zoth and do what is necessary to protect them?" she said, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that left no room for her gaze. Looking down at him, Adrienne's tone shifted as she asked, "Do you solemnly swear, on whatever god or idol you worship, that you will meet the needs of the citizens of N'Zoth and do what is necessary to protect them?" she asked, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that left no room for evasion. Blood spilled from Ryux's lips as he forced himself to answer, his voice trembling yet unwavering in its intent. "I would give my life for them if I had another to give," he said, each word dragged through the last of his strength, "again and again, if I had to." She watched him for a moment longer before continuing, "Will you swear allegiance to the nation of Enos and answer its call when summoned?" she asked, her grip tightening slightly on her staff as the question hung between them. Ryux blinked slowly, the edges of his vision fading as disbelief and resolve warred within him, yet he forced the answer out regardless. "If I could, I would answer, with Bardic in hand," he said, his voice weakening but still carrying the shape of conviction. Satisfied, Adrienne gave a small, decisive nod. "Very well then," she said just as another wave of shells descended, the blue veil flaring up again once more, surrounding even Ryux, as explosions tore into the ground beyond its boundary. As the protective barrier shimmered and faded again, Adrienne lifted her staff and spoke a single word. "Rejuvenaire," she said, and a concentrated bolt of green energy surged from its tip into Ryux's ruined body. The effect was immediate and violent in its own way as his crushed gauntlet was blown free from his hand, while flesh and bone beneath it began to reconstruct. Where his legs had ended in ruin, new growth surged outward in a rush of steaming magic, muscle and sinew knitting together beneath the rain as sensation returned in a flood that left him gasping. Ryux stared down in stunned silence as his body restored itself beneath him, the weight of what had just occurred struggling to settle into something real as breath returned to him in fuller measure. Above them, a chain of explosions tore across the decks of the Diablos, the massive airship shuddering as its own cannons roared to life, their fire turning inward toward the city's central castle. The thunder of their barrage layered over the chaos below as fire struck the spires, pulverizing their stone under the sustained assault. Adrienne clapped her hands together once in sharp, delighted satisfaction as she squealed. "Right on cue," she said, her eyes lifting toward the ship as its guns continued to fire. "It looks like Xylef has finally taken control of the Diablos," she added, more than satisfied. The bombardment intensified as the opposite side of the airship redirected its cannons, sending precise, devastating fire toward the hidden artillery beyond the city's walls. One by one, the distant cannons fell silent under the assault, their positions reduced to smoldering ruin as the Diablos continued its siege without discrimination. Gradually, the thunder of cannon fire waned, leaving only the steady, relentless fall of rain as the final echoes faded into the storm. Through the broken gate, Aurelian and undead forces surged forward in a unified tide, pouring into the streets of N'Zoth as they advanced toward the central citadel. Adrian turned her gaze back to Ryux, who still knelt in the mud, whole once more, yet visibly shaken by everything that had unfolded. "Go," Adrian said, her voice cutting cleanly through the din as she lifted her arm and gestured toward the distant sprawl of the city. "Take back your crown from the man pretending to be your king," she continued, her tone steady and unyielding as the weight of her command settled over Ryux and the men who had survived the onslaught of artillery fire. Swinging herself back into the saddle, Adrian gathered the reins in one hand and turned her steed with a controlled pull, the beast snorting beneath her, unmoved by the gore and ruin surrounding it. As she guided it forward, passing behind the remaining regiments of the dead, she cast one final glance over her shoulder and added, "And bring him to me."
All right, this is the last chapter. This is the end, which is really just the beginning. But it's all set up, it's all ready to go, and I'm going to take a hit and get a drink, and I suggest you do the same, and within the next 3 minutes, we'll start the ending. That last chapter needs so much editing that I didn't even want. I only touched a little. I didn't even want to fucking go through it. I'll do it later. It's just too much. All the dialogue has been fucked up and skewed. But one of the last things I was gonna do is, like, after everything's like more tightened, I was going to go back through all the dialogue in the whole story and just revise just the dialogue. That was just going to be last, because if I do it now, then I'll still do it over and over and over again and never get anything done. So I was just going to wait and do that as one of the last things I do after all the edits and shit. Also, there's a few characters that kind of talk with a more refined intellectualness to them, and that doesn't really isn't represented correctly right now. But I was gonna do that later too. All right, well, here it is. Here's the end. Right now. Yeah, I just said all of that while muted, so let me just start over because I'll start where I ended. I'm a pro streamer, if you can't tell. I was muted this whole time, and my camera has been so off-center that my model's probably just been sitting there frozen, so just a little tip for you if you're trying to be a pro streamer like me, you know, just always mute yourself, don't ever talk to chat, and point your camera at the wall, and that's the best things you can do for your stream. I do it all the time.
Chapter 37. Eye for an Eye. Vert D / Lizyra / 30 / Y997 / 6th Age, Dusk Tide. S. Till bound at the wrists by a warm, unyielding ring of light, Isaac twisted against it with mounting frustration, his shoulders tensing as he tried to force even an inch of slack from the spell, but the magic held firm no matter how much strength he poured into it. Just beyond his reach, his sword, diamond whip, belts, and harnesses lay scattered in a careless heap, every tool he needed sitting close enough to taunt him, yet impossibly far from his grasp. A quiet tap of wood against his side snapped his focus as Vivian nudged him with the end of her staff, the gesture more command than warning, urging him to still himself. Her hood cast most of her face in shadow, though the rigid set of her posture spoke clearly enough, and when he failed to comply, the staff came down across the back of his head with a sharp crack.
Alright, I've noticed that OBS is not picking up the background noise. What the fuck? Why is it doing that? Oh wow, it says OBS crashed, so I don't even know if the stream's still going right now, but it says we're still live, but it also says that the stream I'm afraid to click on that. Why can it hear my mic but it can't hear the internet browser? Wooga. All right, can it hear this? Can it hear this? What about this? Alright, I'm going to have to add a new source real quick. So just a moment. It just pisses me off that it does this sometimes. I don't know why. Which one? I never remember which one it is. Is it application audio? Yeah, I think that's it. I'm just stupid. I haven't done this in a while, so it looks foreign. Bowser, not browser. I mean browser, not Bowser. Man, I'm dying. Browser. Okay, it looks like Bowser. So does it work? Nope. I guess we're going. We're gonna raw dog it. All right, get ready. We're raw dogging. Sorry
Threw it
about
back
this.
into both hands afterward, gripping it tightly while her attention shifted past him toward Cyrex and Richard, listening as they spoke without a word of her own. Boots pressed into the softened dirt behind Isaac, followed by the alluring sway of movement as a taller woman approached, her long, curly red hair bouncing against her shoulders with each step. She paused near the group, glancing between them before settling her gaze on Cyrex. "Hey," she asked, her tone edged with impatience, "what are we supposed to do with the others?" Cyrex barely spared her more than a glance over his shoulder, irritation already creeping into his voice. "Would it kill you to have a little patience, Amber?" Her nose turned up at that, and with a sharp exhale she slammed the head of her battle axe into the ground, leaning her weight against its handle as though bracing herself against the conversation. "Patience," she scoffed. "We've been tracking these assholes for weeks, maybe longer." Without even turning, Richard cut in, his tone clipped with annoyance. Friend. We're talking business here." Amber rolled her eyes at him, though the tension didn't leave her shoulders as she shifted her gaze down to Isaac. "This has been such a pain in my ass, you know," she muttered to herself. Richard's voice turned cold at her complaint, and he finally looked over, his glass blue eyes hard as ice. "A pain in your ass," he repeated, the words edged with disbelief. "We've been gone so long my wife's probably found another man, thinking I'm dead, friend." Off to the side, metal clicked and rattled as a wolf beastman fumbled with his flintlock rifle, his stomach growling loud enough to draw attention. "I'm so hungry I could eat the sleeping imp over there," he muttered, licking his teeth. Cyrex's head snapped toward him immediately. "Don't you fucking dare," he warned. "Last thing I need is you eating our leverage again." The beastman only shrugged, slinging the rifle over his shoulder before undoing his trousers. Without a shred of shame, he pulled out his cock, all the way down to the knot, dragging it out through the slit of his pants as he began pissing against the side of the nearest caravan wagon, the stream splattering loudly against the wood. A young Feladay girl nearby turned her head away at once, her cheeks flushing beneath the shadow of her hood as she clutched her staff close to her chest. "You're so gross, Ajax," she said quietly, trying not to look. He half turned back toward her anyway, still midstream, grinning while he pissed all over Adele and Osiris's sleeping forms. "What?" he shot back. "It's not like you haven't seen my cock before." The stream tapered off into a few last dribbles, and he gave a lazy shake before tucking himself away again before flashing Isaac a wink. Amber let out a low chuckle, eyes drifting toward the girl as she rested her chin against her forearm on the axe handle. "Don't be so modest, Helgen," she teased. "We all know you'll be sucking on his piss stick later tonight." Crude and unrestrained laughter broke out among the group, though it never reached Isaac or Helgen, both of whom remained silent for entirely different reasons. The soft mud shifted again around their feet as Cyrex turned fully this time, stepping forward before lowering himself into a crouch beside Isaac. The smirk on his face didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's keep this simple," he said. "You tell me where the dragon is, and I'll only kill one of you." His gaze flicked briefly toward the others before settling back on Isaac. "Obviously not the Kitsune," he continued, almost conversationally. "If we kill her, the Kitsune family would have the entire empire come down on us like a storm, and I'm not interested in that kind of attention. But the long-haired brat." He shrugged lightly. "That's fair. She's the reason we're in this mess anyway. Her monster killed Roberto, after all." Isaac didn't find his offer as charming. After conjuring a throat full of viscous fluid, he spat straight into Cyrex's face. "Fuck you," he said low and venomously. "My blade would have taken him if Nox hadn't gotten there first." Cyrex froze for half a second before slowly wiping the spit from his cheek, but Richard moved first, stepping in and lowering himself beside them with a calmer expression that felt far more dangerous. "Come on, friend," Richard said, almost gently. "Roberto wasn't perfect, but he was a good man. A life for a life, that's all we're asking. And the dragon? That's more than a fair trade. A proper way to honor him." For the first time in a long while, Isaac felt it settle deep in his chest, not anger, not yet, but something colder. Helplessness. Powerlessness. Weakness. He lifted his head anyway, meeting Richard's gaze without flinching. "I don't know how yet," he said, voice tightening with promise, "but I'm going to fucking kill every last one of you." Amber's grin widened at that as she straightened slightly, shifting her stance toward him. "I don't doubt that you could, big guy," she said, almost amused. "But lucky for us, your friends aren't waking up anytime soon, and as long as Vivian keeps the squeeze on you, you're not doing a damn thing." Cyrex finished wiping his face clean, his patience thinning as he exhaled slowly. "I can only be nice for so long," he muttered, looking down at Isaac. "But I want you to understand something first." He leaned in just enough for the words to land heavy. "I respect you, Sir Isaac Fendrix of Enos." Isaac's gaze dropped at the sound of his name. Leoler of Enos. "I respect." He leaned in just enough for the words to land heavy. "I respect you, Sir Isaac Leoler of Enos." Isaac's gaze dropped at the sound of his name spoken with that title still clinging to it, the weight of it pressing heavier than the bindings ever could, and for a moment he said nothing as the dirt beneath his knees blurred beneath a tightening jaw. "Oh, come on now," Cyrex went on, the corner of his mouth curling as he paced a slow half-circle around him. "I've learned quite a bit about you while you and your little troop sat comfortably at your hideout in Sios. Wormspire, wasn't it?" He tilted his head slightly, studying Isaac like a curiosity. "Or how the people across Lesmera like to refer to your little band of dysfunctional idiots as the Wanderbound Watch. Valiant warriors, cleaning up the Empire's messes while putting down every bit of miasmic filth that crawls out of the fog. For the right amount of coin, of course." A soft snort came from behind as Helgen leaned forward just enough for her voice to carry, her tail flicking idly behind her. "Oh, such titles," she teased, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You must be very important." Cyrex brushed a hand back through his hair beneath the band at his brow, the motion almost thoughtful as he continued. "You remind me of myself, in a way," he said, though there was nothing kind in it. "Serving people you despise, bound to causes you never chose, all while convincing yourself it's for something noble, something worth protecting." His eyes sharpened as they settled back on Isaac. "It would be a shame to kill someone like you." The words dragged something harsher out of Isaac, more snarl than speech as he lifted his head just enough to meet him again. "Why don't you just take our coin and rarities and be done with it?" he said, breath tight with restrained anger. "What we pulled from that temple is worth more than 10,000 in gold and platinum, easy." Cyrex let out a low laugh that held no amusement, only dismissal, and he waved a hand as if brushing the offer aside like dust. "I don't give a fuck what you were doing or what you plundered from that wretched place," he said. "And what would I ever need with your trinkets or your coin?" His voice hardened as he leaned forward slightly. "The blood dragon pays us well. Your wealth means nothing to me. Just give me the dragon's location, so we can be rid of all this. There are hundreds, if not thousands of feral dragons across the continent," Isaac shot back, the words coming faster now. "So why Nox?" For a moment, Cyrex didn't answer, and then he straightened, rising to his full height as he looked down on him. "I could have handed them a random fool's head and any dragon I wanted," he said, his voice becoming more calculated. "The dragon heads wouldn't have known the difference. But I want the ones that killed Roberto." His jaw tightened faintly. In a world this abysmal, there still needs to be some sense of justice. The answer drew a bitter breath from Isaac, something between a laugh and a growl as he shifted against the binding again, though it still refused him. "I'd rather shit in the bushes and wipe my ass with my bare hands," he said, voice thick with contempt, "than ever tell you where Nox is." The wolf beastman barked out a laugh at that, slapping a hand against his thigh. "Ah, man," he said, grinning wide. "I like this guy." Cyrex only shook his head, though the faint smile that followed didn't last as he stepped closer again. "How long do you think your little cocksocket could go without her head?" he asked almost casually, "before your kitsune could reattach it?" A sharp, immediate tension ran through Isaac as he jerked against the light binding, pain flaring through his shoulders. "Don't you fucking touch her," he snapped, the words ripping out of him. The response came swift and brutal as Cyrex drove his boot down, forcing Isaac's face into the mud, grinding him there while he looked up toward Amber with an easy, almost bored expression. "What do you think, Amber?" he asked with a shrug. "Off with her head." Amber didn't let a second go to waste. With a grunt, she hoisted her battle axe up onto her shoulder, then used her foot to roll Lizyra onto her back, the girl's body shifting loosely in her sleep. Aye, Captain," she said, voice bright with cruel enthusiasm as she lifted the axe higher, her muscles tightening for the swing. Lizyra only stirred enough to murmur through a soft snore, her lips curling into a faint smile as her head tilted to one side. "No, you can't eat him, Nox," she mumbled drowsily. "He wouldn't learn his lesson if you did." A quiet giggle slipped out of her before she sank back into her breathing, unaware of the blade poised above her throat. Amber began the downward motion. And then something seized her. It wasn't a strike, not in any way she understood, but a sudden, violent sensation that locked through her body like the instant before a bone breaks, akin to the flash of white light behind the eyes one experiences upon a blow to the center of the face. Her arms refused to obey her, the axe halting mid-descent as her grip faltered, and beneath her, her legs buckled as though the strength had been stripped clean from them. A sickening pressure folded through her neck and shoulders, as her body collapsed inward on itself. While Nox came crashing down upon her, crushing her with an overwhelming impact that completely erased her. Bone and flesh collapsed beneath his weight in a wet, crushing burst, her body reduced in an instant to an unrecognizable ruin of blood and shattered matter pressed into the mud where she had stood. The roar that followed tore through the dusk as if it had splintered reality, paralyzing the air itself as Nox lifted his head, his wings spreading wide behind him, each beat stirring grit and debris across the ground. No one could move. No one could even draw a breath. Vivian couldn't even turn to face the beast, let alone conjure a spell in defense, as Nox's jaws closed around her head and neck in one swift motion. His jagged teeth sank through her flesh and bone as he wrenched her upward, tearing her free from her own body. What remained of her dropped lifelessly as he swallowed what he had claimed with 2 heavy gulps, his throat working as he flicked his head once. Turning to Ajax, a heat gathered in his chest that curdled into a molten glow cradling the back of his throat. A twisting torrent of blackened red magma spilled from his maw, clinging where it struck as it slathered Ajax from head to toe before he could move. The beastman's scream tore loose as the molten spray devoured him, fur burning away to reveal skin that blackened and split beneath the heat, his body collapsing into a smoldering, ruined mass before the sound could fully leave him. Vivian's headless body hit the dirt with a dull thud, and with it, the light binding Isaac's wrists flickered and unraveled, the warmth vanishing as the magic dissipated. Surging to his feet, he snatched up Amber's fallen axe in one fluid motion, the weight of it biting into his grip as he turned, closing the distance to Helgen in a single step. The blade came down cleaving clean through her neck before she could form even the first syllable of a spell. Her head separated in a spray of dark blood, tumbling across the mud as her body crumpled backward beside her staff. For a moment, her legs started twitching, her tail thrashed in violent, uncontrolled spasms as shock tore through what remained of her dying corpse. Pain suddenly lanced through Isaac, catching him off guard. A blade drove into his side and slid through his flesh, skewering his lower abdomen as Richard forced his weapon down to its blade catch, the impact knocking the breath from him as heat flooded through his core. Reacting instinctively, he snapped his head forward, slamming it into Richard's face, bone cracking as the man's nose broke beneath the strike. The pressure vanished as Richard staggered back, releasing the hilt. Above it all, Nox was already on the move. With a powerful surge of his wings, he launched himself through the air, his shadow sweeping across the ground as he hurtled straight toward Cyrex. With a ragged cry that tore up through his chest, Isaac wrenched Richard's blade free from his own side, the steel dragging through torn flesh as hot blood spilled after it, and before the pain could fully take hold he surged forward and drove that same sword straight back into Richard's gut. The impact folded the man slightly, breath catching in his throat as Isaac twisted the blade hard, once, then again, grinding it deeper before ripping it free and letting the blood pour out between them. Across the chaos, Cyrex dropped low and rolled beneath Nox's bulk, both daggers flashing as he dragged them brutally. Then again, with a ragged cry that tore up through his chest, Isaac wrenched Richard's blade free from his own side, the steel dragging through torn flesh as hot blood spilled after it, and before the pain could fully take hold he surged forward and drove that same sword straight back into Richard's gut. The impact folded the man slightly, breath catching in his throat as Isaac twisted the blade once, then again, grinding it deeper before ripping it free and letting the blood pour out between them. Across the chaos, Cyrex dropped low and rolled beneath Nox's bulk, both daggers flashing as he dragged them brutally along the dragon's exposed underside, carving the flesh open in a wet, tearing line that spilled heat and entrails into the mud. He came out of the motion already rising, feet finding purchase as he pivoted away, eyes never leaving the beast as another stream of molten black-red magma twisted across the ground behind him and slammed into the caravan wagons. Flames took hold at once, devouring wood and canvas alike as the fire roared to life, casting everything in a violent, flickering glow while Nox writhed across the earth, his body convulsing under the pain. Isaac held Richard's gaze as the light began to leave it, watching the final moments of awareness drain away before he shoved the long sword back into his abdomen one last time, and then kicked him aside, sending the body collapsing into Ember's remains. Turning from it, he faced Cyrex with the burning caravan at his back, heat licking at his skin while smoke curled into the darkening air. Behind him, Nox let out a broken, helpless squeal, his massive form shuddering as he lay stretched across the ground, the glow in his throat dimming as whatever strength he had left bled out into the dirt. Cyrex drew in a slow breath, chest rising as he steadied himself, though the edge in his voice remained. "I really didn't want to kill it," he said, eyes flicking toward the dragon before settling back on Isaac, "but this whole fucking mess didn't leave me much choice." Blood ran down Isaac's body in thick, steady sheets, soaking into his clothes, dripping from his fingers as his vision pulsed in and out of clarity, the world narrowing and widening with each unsteady breath while Cyrex began to circle him at a measured pace. "I told you," Isaac forced out, his voice rough and wet as he swallowed against the blood rising in his throat, "I'd kill every last fucking one of you." Cyrex didn't stop moving, his steps slow and deliberate as he watched him begin to falter. "It's over, Isaac," he said. "You're bleeding." As he watched him begin to falter. "It's over, Isaac," he said. "You're bleeding out. I don't need to do a damn thing except wait." Isaac's hand fumbled at his only belt, secured tightly at his waist, fingers slick and unsteady as they found a potion flask, struggling to unclip it before it slipped free and fell from his grasp. The glass shattered at his feet, the contents spilling uselessly into the dirt. A low laugh slipped from Cyrex as he continued circling. "Oh, did you drop your little potion?" he asked, the mockery thinly veiled beneath the exhaustion in his tone. Isaac leaned heavily against the long sword still in his grasp, using it to hold himself upright as the ground threatened to rise up and take him. "It didn't have to end like this," Cyrex went on, his voice hardening as he closed the distance by another step. "We could have all walked away, minus one person and a dragon, but your stupid pet made that choice for you." "Shut the fuck up," Isaac rasped, the words scraping out past blood and broken breath. That answer drew Cyrex closer, his expression sharpening as he leaned in just enough for the threat to settle heavy between them. "You really don't have any manners, do you?" he asked. "First thing I'm going to do is slit your little cock sleeve's throat. Then I'll take that elf's pistol and shove it up your kitsune's cunt and blast her all the way back to the capital and convince the emperor you raped and murdered her." His lips curled faintly. "And before that, I'll cut off the elf's cock and ram it down his own throat." Something in Isaac snapped. With a sudden burst of motion that nearly cost him his balance, he hurled Richard's long sword straight at him. "Shut the fuck up," he roared. Cyrex twisted aside just as the blade cut past him. And in that same instant, Nox's tail swept low across the ground, smashing into Cyrex's legs and ripping his footing out from under him. As he hit the ground, Isaac's body gave forward as if pulled by gravity itself, collapsing down onto him as his hand found one of Cyrex's sheathed daggers. The blade slid from its scabbard with a hiss, rose, and fell in repeating stabs, each strike driving into his stomach again and again, its wet impacts punctuated by Cyrex's hoarse cries as the steel bit deep. "Save me a spot down in Infernalis, would you?" Isaac choked out, dragging in a breath that tasted like copper and iron as he raised the dagger high once more. Each stab tore through flesh, but Cyrex's mind had already begun to slip somewhere else entirely. Pain flared, distant and overwhelming all at once, yet beneath it came something softer, something familiar. Lillian. Her face surfaced through the haze, her voice threading through the noise, every memory he had of her crashing forward in a flood he couldn't stop. Her hands, her warmth, the quiet moments that had nothing to do with blood, coin, or survival, they filled the space where everything else began to fall away, leaving him suspended between agony and euphoria. Isaac's arm tensed, the dagger poised above Cyrex's face, ready to drive down. And then a voice reached him. "Don't kill him," the voice pleaded. Lizyra's sudden words halted him mid-motion, the blade trembling in his grip as it hung inches above Cyrex's face. "I have to fucking kill him," Isaac forced out, his breath hitching, more blood spilling from his mouth than air. Struggling upright behind them, Lizyra pushed herself onto her hands and knees as she looked out across the campsite, her eyes taking in the bodies, the fire, and the ruin of it all. "You and Nox have done enough," she said, her voice strained but steady. "Let him go." Isaac remained where he was, frozen over Cyrex, his body shaking as blood pooled beneath them, every instinct screaming at him to finish it while something else held him there. Tears slid down Cyrex's temples into the dirt as he dragged in a ragged breath, his hands clutching at his torn abdomen as he slowly, painfully pulled himself free. He didn't look back. He couldn't. One step, then another, his body barely holding together as he staggered through the darkness of the Eldin Wooge, leaving his daggers behind in the mud. Lizyra's lips moved softly as she drew in a breath. "Dispellera," she whispered. Light burst outward from her in a sudden flare, crackling across the campsite as it spread over Adele, Kitsune, and Osiris, the magic breaking whatever hold had forced them asleep. They jolted awake almost at once, breath catching as they pushed themselves upright, blinking through the haze of sleep while their eyes adjusted to the carnage around them. Adele stared out at the burning wagons, the bodies scattered across the ground, and the blood soaking everything it touched, her expression twisting as the reality of it settled in. "Holy fucking ass fuck," she gasped, dragging a hand down her face. "What in the hell's happened?" Pinned against the dirt by exhaustion more than injury, Lizyra forced air into her lungs in shallow, trembling pulls before turning her head toward Kitsune, her voice frayed but urgent as she said, "Nox is in really bad shape, you have to save him," and even as she spoke her eyes were already searching for the dragon's failing form beyond the bodies and burning wreckage. At once Kitsune sprang to her feet, the motion sharp with instinct rather than thought, and rushed to Nox's side as her wand slipped into her grip, the silver mithril nitrate still clinging to her tail and fur caught what little light remained in the dying sky, glistening faintly as she began her incantation, her voice trembling only slightly while her magic gathered. Beneath her hands, the damage Nox had suffered began to answer her call, his torn flesh knitting in slow, unnatural motion as spilled organs shuddered and drew back into his body, pulled by threads of white radiance that flared brighter with each word she forced from her lips. Not waiting, Lizyra staggered across the blood-soaked ground and dropped to Isaac's side, her hands already fumbling across her belt as she tore free every healing potion she had, pressing one after another to his lips and forcing him to drink despite the blood choking his throat, each swallow dragging him a little further back from the edge he had nearly slipped over. In stunned silence, Adele and Osiris stood taking in the carnage that had swallowed the camp whole, their eyes dragging across the torn bodies, the scorched earth, and the caravan wagons behind them collapsing into a slow, smoldering ruin that crackled softly in the quiet dusk. Air clawed its way back into Isaac's chest as the potions took hold, his wounds tightening, closing, burning as life returned where it had nearly fled, and through a ragged choke of breath he managed, "We need to kill him," the words scraping up from somewhere deeper than anger. Lizyra's hand snapped across his face with a sharp crack as she glared down at him and said, "No. You and Nox murdered enough people for one day." Blinking through the sting, Isaac dragged in another breath as sensation crept back into his limbs, his voice weaker but no less defiant as he said, "They were going to kill you," and the words came out as if that alone should have justified everything. Her gaze swept over the wreckage again, the corpses, the scorched ground, the remnants of what had once been their caravan, then looked back at him with a bitter edge beneath her exhaustion and she said, "Well, you did a pretty damn good job at stopping that, didn't you?" the weight of it settling heavily between them. Flexing his fingers as warmth slowly returned, Isaac swallowed, and said, "I had him." Turning away from him, Lizyra looked toward Kitsune, who still knelt beside Nox with her magic burning through what little mana and strength she had left, and asked, "Do you think you could revive any of them?" The question quiet, and hardly uncertain, as if she already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken. Before Kitsune could respond, Isaac surged against the ground with what little strength he could muster, his voice tearing through the air as he shouted, "Don't you fucking dare try to revive any of them," and even in his weakened state there was something feral in the way the words came out, something unwilling to let go of what had just been done. Kitsune didn't look at him right away, her focus remained locked on Nox as she steadied her breathing and forced her magic to hold, and only once the worst of his wounds had sealed, did she glance back over her shoulder, her voice thin with exhaustion as she said, "Don't worry. After everything I've cast today back in the temple, and after healing Nox and you, I won't have any mana left to do anything else. I'll probably need to curl up with Adele after we salvage what we can and sleep out here for a few days just to recover." The quiet that followed was fragile, stretched thin across the ruined camp. Until the sharp crack of shattering glass cut through it, drawing every head toward the sound as an empty potion bottle struck the rocks nearby and burst apart. Isaac's own long sword abruptly punched through Lizyra's chest from behind, driving clean through her as Richard rose from the ground where he had been left for dead, his grip tightening around the hilt as he twisted the blade with brutal intent, grinding it through and mutilating her heart while he said low and bitterly, "Sorry, friend," the words tasting wrong even as he spoke it. The blade tore free only to drive forward again, plunging through her a second time before he abandoned it and turned, already fleeing toward the treeline as if the act itself had reignited whatever ambition he had left. Lizyra's body gave out beneath her, her knees hitting the dirt as blood filled her mouth, and through it she managed a broken, "Fuck," before she collapsed fully, the life draining from her even as the world seemed to hold its breath. Osiris reacted first, his pistol already in his hand as he took aim and fired shot after shot toward the retreating figure, the cracks of gunfire chasing Richard as he dove through brush and vanished into the woods without slowing, leaving only the echo behind. For a moment, no one moved, then Adele dropped to Lizyra's side, panic breaking through whatever composure she had left as she raised her hands and cast the black aura that spilled over Lizyra's body as she said tight with urgency, "I don't know what I can do besides keep her from bleeding out." Kitsune rushed over, her composure shattering as tears streamed down her face, and she dropped beside Lizyra, hands shaking as she pressed them against her chest and tried to force another incantation through lips that wouldn't steady. Her voice broke as she said frantically, "I don't know if I have enough mana left to properly heal her." For a moment, no one moved, then Adele dropped to Lizyra's side, panic breaking through whatever composure she had left as she raised her hands and cast the black aura that spilled over Lizyra's body as she said tight with urgency, "I don't know what I can do besides keep her from bleeding out." Kitsune rushed over, her composure shattering as tears streamed down her face, and she dropped beside Lizyra, hands shaking as she pressed them against her chest and tried to force another incantation through lips that wouldn't steady. Her voice broke as she said frantically, "I don't know if I have enough mana left to properly heal her." Dragging himself across the dirt despite everything still wrong with his body, Isaac clawed his way to Lizyra's side and pulled his long sword free before cradling her head in his lap, his voice collapsing into desperation as he cried out, "Fucking save her," his hands trembling as if he could hold her together by will alone. "Don't fucking touch her," Adele snapped, her focus never breaking as she fought to stabilize the damage. "You'll drain what little healing magic Kitsune has left if you make contact since you're still wounded." Tears streamed freely down Isaac's face, cutting through the grime and blood as they struck the mud below, while Kitsune scrambled between arcane magic that continued to fail and prayers that went questionably unanswered. Growling furiously under her breath as she wept, Kitsune popped the cork of a mana potion from her belt, no longer caring that she was past her limit, and downed its contents in one long pull. Throwing the empty bottle over one shoulder, she began an arcane incantation as she laid her hands upon Lizyra's chest once more. This time an explosion of green light erupted from them as Lizyra's wounds began to close, her flesh sealing where dragon steel had torn through, the evidence of the injury fading until only faint scars remained. Time stretched as the crackle of the dying caravan's fire cradled the silence that lingered. Then, with a shaky breath, Kitsune wiped the snot running from her nose with the back of her forearm, her hands falling away from Lizyra's chest as the last of her strength gave out, and in a voice barely louder than the embers behind them, she said, "She's dead."
Are you going away to the place we used to dream of? Radiance and grace, the only warmth I knew. I know I've been there before with you. Now you're fading from me, fading from me, you. Yeah, you're fading out of you. disappear, fading as you sink, so covered in clear, staring through the sea. Don't wait to breathe, the sun is setting still.